The last thing I saw before I died was a loading screen, and honestly, that tells you everything about the life I was living before this one started. Not a car crash, not a hospital ceiling, just my monitor, frozen mid-patch update. At 2 a.m., with cold ramen going stiff beside my keyboard, my heart stopped. No warning, no dramatic last breath, just my biological heart after 27 years of caffeine and stubbornness quietly clocking out. I, Kai, former game developer, died alone. In a gaming chair with unwashed hair and 17 browser tabs still open behind the loading screen. And then I woke up somewhere else, which was not something I had planned for, which is not something anyone plans for, I suppose, but that felt especially true for me. The first thing I noticed was the cold, not the polite kind that makes you reach for a blanket, the aggressive kind that goes straight through you like it has somewhere to be. The second thing I noticed was that I could not feel my hands at all, which made complete sense, as it turned out, because I no longer had hands in any recognizable form. I looked down, 4 paws, dark gray fur, tiny, shaking against the white ground, like they were personally offended by the snow they were sitting in. I want to be honest about what happened next. I want to tell you I handled it with calm and analytical thinking, and years of gaming experience behind me. What actually came out of my body was a sound I can only describe as a smoke alarm having the worst moment of its entire operational life. Then I fell sideways into the snow. Then I tried to get up. Then I fell again. This process repeated 4 more times before I managed to stay upright for 3 seconds. And while I was doing that, while I was face planting into frozen ground in a body that refused to cooperate with any instruction I sent it, a window appeared in my vision. Blue, clean edges, the kind of UI a programmer builds when he has too much ambition and not enough hours in user testing to catch his own mistakes. The notification read, Host body identified. Species, Dire Wolf, Cursed Bloodline. Curse seal active. Current level, 1. Warning, do not engage SRANK entities. And then below that, in text that felt larger than it was, estimated survival time against SRANK threat, 4 minutes. I read every line twice, then I looked at my tiny paws. Then I read the 4 minutes line one more time, just to make absolutely certain I had understood it correctly. 4 minutes. Against an S-rank, someone in whatever system ran this world had done the actual math and published the result, without any apparent concern for how I might receive it. I was level 1. I was. The size of a house cat. I could not walk without falling over. And the system. I had already calculated my survival window down to the minute. I sat in the snow and stared at the notification and had a brief, private, and comprehensive moment of despair. Then I pulled myself together, because despair does not update your status screen. I opened every system tab available and started reading, the way I always read patch notes. Fast, skipping nothing, looking for the single line that changes everything else. The lore entry for my species said, Standard dire wolves are classified as B-rank apex predators of the Northern Tundra. The Cursed Bloodline is a separate and distinct classification entirely. Cursed dire wolves accumulate power through consumption, absorbing the abilities and life force of the enemies. They defeat in combat over the course of their development. There is no recorded ceiling on the power of a fully awakened Cursed Dire Wolf specimen. None. The Hunter Guilds classified it as an open variable and treated it accordingly. The Hunter Guilds, during the period now called the Great Purge, determined that an unchecked Cursed Dire Wolf was an existential threat to the established power hierarchy of this world. All specimens were hunted down. All specimens confirmed eliminated. Records sealed. Species listed as extinct. Date of last confirmed specimen, 212 years ago. I stared at the words. No recorded ceiling for a long time. The curse seal was suppressing 97% of my base abilities, according to the status display. 3% of a power with no recorded ceiling. And at 3%, I was already processing sensory input faster than anything I had managed across 27 years of human life. Right there in the snow, level 1, the size of a stuffed animal, technically extinct, with a 4-minute survival estimate printed at the top of my status screen, I felt something familiar. The specific feeling, earned across 14,000 hours of gaming, of looking at a build that every other player had written off and seeing exactly what it was going to become. That feeling lasted approximately 40 seconds. Then a branch snapped behind me and I spun around. I nearly fell over again, and the feeling dissolved completely. She came out of the trees like she had always been part of them, massive. Gray fur so dense it looked like armor plating. Eyes the color of frozen honey, pale gold, and completely unreadable. She moved without sound, except for that one branch. And I understood immediately that the branch had been a deliberate choice. She could have arrived in total silence. She wanted me to hear her coming. My mother. Apparently, she looked at me. Then she looked at the snow around me, where I had been falling for 12 minutes, evidence of every failed attempt scattered in every direction. Then she looked back at me. I could not read wolf expressions precisely yet, but that look translated clearly. It said, "They sent me the defective one this time." She picked me up by the scruff of my neck, and I dangled in the frozen air, paws hanging uselessly, system notification still blinking, snow falling in silence around us. I had died in a gaming chair at 2 a.m. I had woken up as a cursed extinct wolf pup in a frozen tundra. I was being carried through a blizzard like a piece of forgotten luggage. Things could only improve from here. I told myself that with great confidence. I was completely wrong about that, but I did not know it yet, and the ignorance was doing useful work. The den was cut into the base of a rock ridge, narrow at the entrance and wider inside, smelling of cold earth and old fur and something underneath. Both that felt like shelters supposed to feel. 3 other pups were already in the back corner, piled together like one organism made of ears and tails and paws, going in every direction at once. They were bigger than me, all 3. I had been a wolf for 14 minutes, and I was already the runt of the litter. Of course I was. Of course. That particular detail had been arranged specifically for me, clearly. I lay down in the remaining space, roughly the area of a large paperback book, and opened the system to read exactly what I was actually working with going forward. Status screen, level 1. Curse. Seal suppressing 97% of base abilities. Void Fang, locked. Shadow Step, locked. Consumption, locked. Curse Resonance. Passive, active at 3%. Every real ability. Locked behind a seal I did not yet understand, in a body I did not yet control, in a world that had spent 2 centuries believing my species was permanently gone. Fine. I had started games at level 1 before. I knew what this felt like. I knew the patience it required, and I had enough of it. That part was not the problem. The problem was that this particular level 1 came with a 4-minute survival estimate, and no respawn option, which was a meaningful difference from every other starting position I had experienced. The first week was an education in humility I had not signed up for, delivered without warning and without any option to return it. Every morning Mother left to hunt and came back with food. Every day I tried to make the body do something new and found another category of thing it refused to do yet. Running was a disaster. Jumping was a disaster. Climbing anything at all was a disaster that ended in falling, followed by more falling, followed by landing in positions that defied reasonable explanation. The largest of my 3 littermates, who I named Brick internally because he had the dimensions and apparent inner complexity of 1, started pushing me away from food on day 2. He did it with the casual certainty of an animal that has never once considered that the thing it is pushing might have opinions about being pushed, or a memory for every time it happens. Day 2, I let it go. Day 3, he did it again, and I filed it. Day 4, he shoved me sideways mid-meal, and I turned and bit the inside of his ear with every milligram my jaw could produce. He made a sound I can only describe as deeply theatrical, and launched himself backward like I had used electricity on him, instead of a single precise bite to a specific nerve cluster. The other 2 pups froze. Mother's head turned from the entrance without her body moving. She held us in her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away and said nothing. I turned back to my food and continued eating slowly, while maintaining peripheral awareness of where Brick had landed, because a lesson is only complete when the recipient has had time to process it. He stared at me from across the den with an expression I recognized from competitive gaming. The expression of someone who dismissed you entirely and has now been forced to update that assessment. He did not push me again. Not that day, not the days after. Some lessons cost 1 ear bite. Brick got a good deal on that particular piece of education. By the end of the 2nd week, something happened I had not fully anticipated. My sensory range began expanding in ways I could feel developing in real time, like a background update running continuously. I could map the entire clearing in front of the den without stepping outside it. I could feel where each pack member was through vibrations in the frozen ground beneath me, each one a distinct signature. I could hear the weather shifting in the pressure changes against my eardrums, hours before the storm arrived. I could smell where prey had been and how long ago and which direction they had left toward. But more than the range itself, I was doing something with the incoming data that no wolf brain around me was doing. My human brain was building a model and updating it without being asked to. Every hunt Mother went on, I tracked her from the den by sound and vibration and scent. I mapped her decision points, the terrain she checked, the routes prey used, the timing of their movements. By the end of month 1, I could have given you the daily schedule of every significant animal within a half kilometer of the den, their patterns and preferences, and the places they consistently avoided. I was level 1 with every ability locked, but I was building the kind of intelligence infrastructure that changes what level 1 means in practice, underneath the number. The system noticed on the last day of month 1. Update. Environmental mapping. Exceptional. Passive scan radius increased to 400 meters. Prey pattern analysis, active. Then below that, note. Historical survival rate for cursed dire wolves at this stage of development is 12%. 12%. The system delivered that with the same tone a weather report uses for rain probability. Informational, completely uninterested in how it landed on the recipient. 12% of my species historically survived to the end of the first year. 88 out of every 100 died before they finished growing. That was the track record I was sitting inside. I stayed with that number for a while. Then I decided it meant I needed to be in the 12. That was the only productive response, and I committed to it without a lot of additional drama. The first real test came 6 weeks in, on a morning when the temperature had become personal and hostile in a way that felt targeted. Mother had gone north. The 3 littermates were chasing each other through the clearing outside with the strategic coherence of 3 pinballs in a machine that was also on fire simultaneously. I was at the tree line, running my passive scan when something entered the 400-meter radius that fit none of the patterns I had built over 6 weeks of continuous mapping. Wrong scent profile. Wrong weight distribution in the ground vibrations. Wrong quality of silence between footsteps. Not prey. Something that moved the way things move when they are hunting. My brain ran the threat calculation in under 2 seconds. 3 pups in the open. 1 incoming predator, narrow den entrance that could be held, mother unreachable in the available time. I produced a sound I had been rehearsing mentally for weeks. A sound that I hoped would read the way I intended it to read. 2 short barks in a specific pattern. The closest replication I could manage of the sound Mother used when she needed immediate movement without explanation. All 3 littermates stopped and looked at me. There was the pause of 3 animals deciding whether to follow something smaller than them. Then I ran for the den entrance, and they followed. We were inside in 8 seconds. 40 seconds later, the snow leopard crossed the clearing, heavy and scarred and moving with the ease of something that had been running this territory for years. It stopped in the center of the clearing and looked at 4 wolf pups staring back at it from a defended position. It ran whatever calculation a snow leopard runs in that situation. Then it left. Brick looked at me from the back of the den, then at the empty clearing, then at me again. His expression asked the question clearly, how did you know that was coming before any of us heard it? I had no way to answer that in wolf language, and in wolf language was the only option available to me in that den. In human language, the answer was 6 weeks of passive mapping, continuous threat signature analysis, and a brain trained on pattern recognition across 27 years. In wolf language, I just looked back at him and said nothing, which landed better than any explanation would have. Some things communicate more clearly through silence than through language. That was the first time the littermates shifted in how they related to me, not respect yet, but something more preliminary and more useful than respect. Something more preliminary, the specific attention of animals that have noticed something in their environment operating outside the parameters they understand. The system updated 2 days after the leopard encounter. Threat response. Successful. XP gained. Then below that, a preview I could read but not yet access. Void Fang. Your bite carries a fragment of the curse energy sealed within you. Contact causes the target's own power to destabilize. The stronger the target, the more severe the destabilization effect. Status. Locked. Which was the answer the system gave me every time I asked for anything that mattered, and it gave it without apology. I read that ability description 3 times. The stronger the target, the more severe the effect. In any game I had played, abilities that scaled with the enemy's own power broke the late game completely open. It meant the hardest opponents were the most rewarding to face. It meant every S-rank hunter who came for me with 4 minutes on their mental timer was going to receive something they had not planned for. If I survived long enough to unlock it, level 1 still. I went back to mapping the forest and watching the patterns and building the model that everything else would eventually depend on. Real winter arrived on day 40. Not the cold that had been present since I opened my eyes in this world. Real winter, the kind that changes every calculation you have made about survival. The temperature dropped to something that no longer felt like weather. It felt like a firm opinion expressed by the environment about whether you deserve to continue existing in it. Prey patterns shifted. Easy food moved to lower ground. Mother's hunts got longer and the returns per trip got smaller. My littermates were hungry in the way that makes young predators loud and reactive. Brick started getting aggressive at meals again. This time I did not bite anything. I let him take my entire share and sat back and watched him eat with the patience of someone 3 moves ahead of the board. He watched me while he ate, waiting for the reaction I was not giving him. I gave him nothing at all. Then 3 hours later, when the den was quiet and settled, I slipped out alone into the dark. The passive map I had built over 6 weeks was detailed enough that I moved through the forest without hesitation. I knew where the frozen creek was. I knew where the ice was thinnest and where animals still came to drink because everywhere else had been solid for weeks. I found rabbit tracks 40 meters from the water. Recent, moving northeast. Rabbits in hard winter stay close to shelter. The rabbit that made those tracks was almost certainly still in the thicket ahead. I circled from downwind, wide and slow, keeping myself invisible to whatever was inside. I found the exit side, the direction the rabbit would run if startled from the opposite end of the thicket. I found a small rise in the ground on that side. Slight, built into the terrain by geography rather than by me. Something that would slow anything moving fast in that direction by half a step. I waited on the far side of that rise. Then I barked once, sharp, from the wrong direction for a predator to be coming from. The rabbit burst from the thicket and ran toward what looked like open ground. It hit the rise at full speed. 3 seconds later, I had my first solo kill. A rabbit. Small. I will not pretend it was a legendary event. But I carried it back and dropped it where everyone could see it. Mother looked at it. Then at me. Then at the dark forest where I had been. Something ran behind her frozen honey eyes. Some calculation reaching a conclusion I could not fully read from outside. She stepped back from the rabbit and looked at me in a way that was clear in its meaning. I could feed first. Brick made a sound low in his throat. Mother's ear turned toward him without her head moving. He stopped. I ate slowly, in the specific, deliberate manner of someone who understands that how you eat matters as much as that you eat, and that the pack is always watching and always updating its model of who you are. The system updated at dawn. Solo hunt successful. XP gained. Pack status shift positive. Level 1. Progress to level 2. 31%. 31%. Still a long road. But I had played games where early levels felt eternal, and the breakthrough came without warning when the accumulated work finally crossed a threshold. I knew how to run the long game. What I had never done was run a game where losing did not produce a respawn screen. That thought stayed in the back of my processing like a notification I could not clear. Winter deepened. The pack found its rhythm. Mother started hunting the locations I had been mentally mapping for weeks, the high ridges and northern tributaries, where prey still moved in quantity. I could not explain my reasoning to her in wolf language. What I could do was be in specific places at specific times and let my behavior speak in the only medium available. She started following my scouts. Brick started following her when she followed me. He did not like it and made sure the entire pack felt exactly how much he did not like it through the specific tension he carried everywhere he went. That tight, watchful energy of a physically dominant animal who is increasingly aware that the smallest member of the family is somehow consistently operating ahead of him, and he cannot identify how or close the gap. I kept one eye on him constantly. Brick was socially intelligent in the way apex predators who live in hierarchies are socially intelligent. He could read a pack. He could feel when his position was being affected. He knew something was wrong with the picture he was looking at. He just could not identify what. And that uncertainty was making him more aggressive rather than less. I flagged it as a priority problem. On day 40, the system sent something I had not seen before, a passive ability activation with no level requirement attached to it at all. Curse Resonance. Passive activated. The sealed curse emits a detectable frequency. High-power entities may perceive this as a threat signal. Curse-sensitive entities may perceive it as recognition. And below that, the line that mattered most. One entity within sensor range has demonstrated a measurable reaction to your resonance output. One entity within range had reacted. I ran the full passive scan immediately. Mother at the entrance, litter mates in the back, the forest in every direction showing normal winter wildlife signatures. And then, at the absolute outer edge of my 400-meter radius, far to the north, something that fit none of the categories in the map I had built over 40 days of continuous observation. Not prey, not any predator I had encountered, something enormous and stationary facing my direction, carrying the specific stillness of something that has found what it was looking for, something that had noticed me, something that was aware, in this moment, that I existed in this forest and was holding that information carefully while deciding what to do next with it. The system gave me one more update on that entry. Entity, classification, unavailable at current level. Recommended action, do not investigate. Estimated threat level, do not investigate. 2 consecutive, do not investigate responses. No numbers, no historical context, no classification tier, just do not investigate, twice, with nothing else attached and no explanation offered. Every other data point the system had given me came with something I could work with. This one just said no. Twice. And the way you say no to someone when explaining the reason would take longer than is available. I thought about the lore I had read on day 1, the Great Purge. Every cursed dire wolf eliminated, all specimens confirmed by the hunter guilds. Confirmed by the people who had organized and executed the elimination themselves, which meant the confirmation came from exactly the source, with the highest motive to make sure it was thorough. And what happened when that organization, after 2 centuries of believing a species was gone, received a frequency signal telling them with measurable evidence that it was not? The thing to the north stayed stationary through the night, By dawn, it was gone. I did not tell myself it had been nothing. That particular comfort was not one I could afford to take. Something out there had noticed me. The question that mattered was what it would do with that information, on what timeline, and with what level of resources behind the decision. I doubled my scouting schedule, extended my map radius, identified exit routes from the den in every direction, and rated them by effectiveness under different terrain and weather conditions. I started tracking human presence indicators in the forest specifically. Chemical traces foreign to any natural creature here. It sounds too regular to be environmental. Snow disturbances that matched no animal gait I had cataloged in 6 weeks of continuous observation. The kind of disturbances only boots make. None of this was visible to my littermates. To them, I was a strange, small pup who ran longer circuits and came back with better results than my size should produce. Strange but useful. In a pack, useful by space. The system leveled me on day 51. I read the update in the dark before dawn while the pack slept around me. Level up. 2. Cursed Seal. 96. Percent minor decrease. Passive scan. Radius increased. Shadow step. Ability preview unlocked. Red only. Shadow step. Movement between shadows without generating sensory signals. At low levels, reduces all detection by 40%. At higher levels, movement becomes completely undetectable. Status. Locked. Shadow step. 40% sensory reduction during movement at low levels, completely undetectable at higher ones. I was a data analyst reborn as a ghost wolf, and the system was showing me what that meant. I would have appreciated the moment more if the system had not followed it immediately with an alert that made the already cold temperature feel significantly colder. Alert. Hunter Guild. Survey beacon activated. Location. 3.1 kilometers northeast. Survey operations typically precede targeted strike deployment. Probability. This survey is directly connected to the resonance detection event on day 40, 78%. That number sat in my vision for a long time. 78% probability. The thing to the north had not kept what it found to itself. Someone was already moving in this direction with a specific purpose in mind. I looked at the sleeping pack. Mother at the entrance, 3 littermates in the back, everything still and warm in the specific fragile quality of safety that exists right before something changes. 3.1 kilometers northeast. A survey team, in guild operational terms, meant an advanced unit of 2 to 5 professionals sent ahead to confirm intelligence before larger resources were committed. They were not here yet, in any significant sense. They were doing what survey teams do, moving through an area methodically, gathering data, preparing the report that determines what gets sent next. But if that report confirmed what they were scanning for, what followed a confirmed survey would not be another survey team with the same equipment and the same number of people. I needed to understand what their equipment could detect before I could build any kind of response to it. Running without that information was guessing. Running with a pack that included 3 pups who could not survive the winter on their own was not a choice I was willing to place on the table as an option. I looked at the den entrance. Dawn was beginning to move the darkness toward gray at the edges. I made a decision that my instincts flagged as dangerous, and my analytical mind classified as necessary information. I was going to get close enough to watch them work and understand what they were looking for, and what they could actually find with the tools they were carrying. Getting out of the den without waking anyone was the first problem to solve. Wolves slept light, Mother especially. But I had mapped this den for 7 weeks and knew every section of the floor. I knew which areas were loose stone and which were solid bedrock. I knew the exact path from where I lay to the entrance that produced 0 sound if each step was placed with full, deliberate care. I moved it from memory in complete darkness, and not a single loose stone shifted under my weight from the first step to the last. Outside, the cold was serious and specific in the way it gets before full dawn in a real winter, the kind that reminds you the world does not have a particular investment in your continued comfort. I moved northeast, using the passive map I had built over 7 weeks, confident in terrain I had mentally walked many times, even before physically crossing it. At 2 kilometers, I picked up the first human scent on the wind, then a second, then a third. 3 people moving in the methodical pattern of professionals who had done this kind of work before. Heavy boots on frozen ground, equipment weight distributed across their backs. Not moving fast, not moving slow. Systematic coverage of ground, the pace of people who are mapping rather than rushing. I circled wide downwind and used the ridge above their position to give myself a clear observation angle without entering any reasonable sightline from below the ridgeline. They came into view between the trees, 3 people in gray tactical gear built for extended cold weather operations, 2 men and a woman who moved like she had been in fields like this her entire working life. The woman moved differently from the 2 men, with the economy of motion that comes from years of field work in exactly this terrain. She carried a handheld device with a small display, sweeping it in slow arcs as she moved and adjusting her direction every 15 seconds to cover new ground. She was scanning for something specific, and she knew exactly how to do it. which told me this was not her first deployment of this kind. I studied her sweep pattern from the ridge for 6 minutes without moving a single muscle or producing any sound or scent shift that the wind might carry down. Then she stopped walking. The display changed. She looked at it, then looked north toward where our den sat, then said something to the 2 men standing beside her. One of the men lifted a separate directional device and aimed it precisely in the general direction of the den, holding it steady while the display processed. If that was a resonance sensor, even through 96% seal suppression, they might be getting a directional fix. Not a species identification at this range and equipment grade, but a directional fix on an anomalous energy reading was all a survey report needed in order to trigger an escalation and bring a larger team. I needed to give them something else to look at. I had 2 choices: withdraw and let the scan continue uninterrupted, or expose myself to redirect their instruments toward a different reading entirely. The calculation took 4 seconds. I came down the ridge slowly and deliberately, making just enough sound to be audible as I moved, coming from the east rather than the north. One small, dark-furred wolf crossing their sightline at approximately 80 meters, moving with the unhurried pace of normal wildlife that has noticed humans and is simply giving them appropriate space. An animal that has noticed humans in its territory and is giving them appropriate space without panicking or fleeing outright. The woman's head came up the moment I was audible. The man with the directional sensor swung it toward me and held it there while I crossed their visual field and disappeared into tree cover on the far side. He said something to the woman. She made a notation. Then the 3 of them continued northeast, moving away from the den in the direction they had been heading before I drew their attention. I watched from the shadow of a fallen tree until their scent dropped below the level where I could track them individually. Then I held the position for 10 more minutes before moving. The system updated as I turned back toward the den. Misdirection. Successful. XP gained. Note: Survey team has logged you as Category C Wildlife. Standard Wolf. Non-target. This classification holds until high sensitivity equipment is used at close range. High sensitivity. Devices are standard equipment for guild strike teams. Estimated return timeline. Unknown. Unknown timeline. Unknown nature of whatever had sent them from the north. A pack completely unaware of what was beginning to circle it. Me at level 2, with every real ability still locked behind a seal running at 96%, in a forest where someone had just filed a report about something they had found here. I had bought time. I was good at buying time. I had done it across 14,000 hours of gaming and across an entire previous professional life of things being due when they were not ready. But time bought is not a problem solved. It is a problem delayed. And delayed problems return with more resources and better equipment and a clearer picture of what they are looking for. The thing in the north had noticed me on day 40. The survey team arrived on day 51. The system put 78% probability on that connection being direct and intentional. Something had sent them. Something that knew what I was, or strongly suspected it, and had chosen to send professionals rather than come itself. That sequence said something specific about what I was dealing with. Patient, resourced. Understanding the value of gathering information before committing to action, which was exactly the operational profile most dangerous to deal with. In my experience, patience combined with resources was always the most dangerous combination you could face across any context. I got back to the den before the littermates woke. I settled into the pile and closed my eyes. The wolf part of my brain did what wolf brains do before dawn in a warm, sheltered den. It tried to sleep. The human part kept one thread running underneath, modeling, processing, running the next 10 scenarios in parallel and rating each by survival probability given the current information set. I looked at the system one last time before sleep finally arrived, reading the same numbers I had read 100 times already. Level 2, Curse Seal at 96%. Days survived, 51. Historical survival rate for my species. At this stage, 12%. Same numbers. Different weight each time I read them. Still in the 12%. For now. By methods that would not hold indefinitely against better equipment and more people. And a clearer identification of what exactly they were tracking in this forest. The survey team was gone. The forest was quiet. But quiet in this world after 51 days of learning what this world actually was did not mean safe. Quiet was just the sound of something on the other side of the trees deciding its next move with the patience of something that had done this kind of work before and knew how to wait. Whatever was out there deciding had not finished with me. It was patient. And patient things across 2 lifetimes now were always the ones that required the most serious and sustained preparation to survive. Level 2, 96% sealed, 1 extinct species, 1 unknown entity to the north, 1 survey team with a filed report and better equipment on the way. I was not going to stay level 2 forever, and that was not optimism speaking. That was the only interpretation of the data that made continuing worth doing. The bar at 31% on level 2 was going to move, and when it moved enough, things were going to change substantially. And when they did, whatever came through those trees next was not going to find the thing it expected to find waiting for it, on this side. It was going to find something that had spent 51 days preparing for exactly this moment, in a body the world thought was extinct, running a power with no recorded ceiling. Through a brain that had spent 27 years learning one specific skill above everything else, how to look at a position that appeared to be a loss and find the line everyone else missed, how to look at a position that appeared to be a loss and find the line that everyone looking at the same board had completely missed. If you were reborn into a body the entire world thinks is extinct, what is the first move you make? Drop it in the comments below. I want to tell you about the day I understood what the curse actually was, because up until day 63, I had been treating it like a game mechanic, a locked ability tree, a stat suppressor, something that would open up as I gained levels and stop being a problem once I hit whatever threshold the system had decided mattered. I had been wrong about that in a very specific and very uncomfortable way, and day 63 was the morning the correction arrived without warning. It started the way most genuinely bad things start, which is to say it started quietly, in the dark, while everyone else was asleep, and there was nothing dramatic happening to signal that anything was about to change. I was running my passive scan at the edge of the den's warmth, monitoring the 400-meter radius the way I had been doing every morning for the past 3 weeks, when I felt it. Not from outside the radius, from inside it, from inside me, specifically, which was a new category of sensory data that I had not previously encountered and was not prepared for. Something deep in my chest, underneath everything, underneath the wolf instincts and the human analytical overlay and the normal biological functions of a body that was still technically a pup, something there ways awake. Not fully, not yet, but aware in the specific way that a system coming online is aware, running its startup checks, testing the connections between itself and the rest of the hardware it was attached to. The system notification appeared in my vision at the same moment I felt the shift, blue and clean and carrying information I was not ready for. Curse seal status. Update. Seal integrity at 95.3%. Rate of decay accelerating due to host development. Projected seal failure. Timeline accelerating beyond original estimate. Then below that, a second line that had not appeared in any previous update. Warning. Curse energy seeking expression. Suppression will become increasingly difficult as host approaches. Level 3. Hosts who attempt to fully suppress. Curse energy during the awakening phase have a 94% fatality rate. That number did not move after I read it 3 times. I read that last line twice with the specific focused attention of someone who has just found the variable in the equation that changes all the other variables. A 94% fatality rate for attempting to fully suppress the curse during awakening. I had been treating the seal as pure protection. That had been wrong. I had been treating the seal as a protection, something keeping me hidden, keeping the resonance output low, keeping the survey teams from getting a clean reading on what I was. The seal was protection, but it was not only protection, it was also a cage, and the thing inside the cage was starting to push against the bars from the inside. It was also a cage, and the thing inside the cage was starting to push against the bars, and if I kept pushing back against it from my side, both sides of the equation ended the same way. I lay very still in the dark and thought about this for a long time. The curse wanted to express itself. That was the language the system used. Expression. Like it was an artistic impulse rather than a power that the Hunter Guilds had organized a species-wide elimination event to prevent from existing in the world. I pulled up the lore entry again and read the consumption mechanic description more carefully than I had on day 1. Cursed Dire Wolves accumulate power through consumption. The absorption process is not voluntary at full awakening. The curse identifies power differentials and moves toward them. Targets with higher power levels produce greater absorption yields. This is the mechanism that produces the no recorded ceiling classification. Not voluntary at full awakening. The curse did not ask. At full awakening, it moved. It identified things with power, and it went toward them, and it took what they had. The stronger the target, the more it took. And the more it took, the stronger I became. And the stronger I became, the more the seal degraded. And the more the seal degraded, the more the curse could express itself. And the cycle had a direction it moved in. And that direction only went one way. And knowing which way it went changed every decision I had been planning to make. I understood now why the Hunter Guilds had not tried to contain the Cursed Dire Wolves, why they had organized a purge instead of a captivity program. You could not put this in a box and wait for it to calm down. The box would become part of it. This changed my planning in several significant ways. The survey team had filed a report. Something from the north had sent them. Whatever came next would not be a survey team. It would be people with better equipment and a clearer objective and training specifically designed for dealing with supernatural entities that did not want to be found. And I had originally planned to hide, to avoid engagement, to stay below the detection threshold and level quietly and let the seal hold until I was strong enough to defend myself if it came to that. That plan had a problem now. The seal was degrading whether I engaged anything or not. The curse was going to push toward expression on its own timeline, not mine. And if it found an expression point before I was ready, before I understood what I was doing with it, the 94% fatality statistic was going to become extremely personally relevant. I needed to level faster, needed to engage with what I was instead of managing it from a distance, and needed to do both without announcing my existence to the strike team. And I needed to do it in a way that did not announce my existence to the survey team's follow-up, whatever form that follow-up was going to take. None of those three requirements were easy to satisfy simultaneously. That was the kind of problem I had always found interesting, back when the worst consequence of failing to solve it was missing a deadline. The system sent another line, which was becoming a habit of arriving precisely when I had already processed enough bad news for one morning. Recommendation: controlled expression. Allow the curse energy to move in small increments, rather than maintaining total suppression. This reduces fatality risk and accelerates healthy awakening. Note: controlled expression will increase resonance output. Detection: risk increases accordingly. Controlled expression increases detection risk. Total suppression increases fatality risk. I was being offered a choice between two bad options with different timelines on the bad outcome, which was a category of problem I had navigated before in a different context. I had made choices like this before, in games, in projects, in the various impossible situations that professional life produces when you least want to deal with them. The framework was always the same. Pick the bad option with the longer timeline, and use the time you just bought to find the third option that neither of the first two had accounted for. I started looking for the third option. It arrived 6 days later, not from the system and not from the forest, but from an unexpected direction entirely. His name, as far as I could give him one in my head, was Ash. Gray-white fur, darker across the shoulders, moving with the caution of someone who had learned every new piece of ground the hard way. He came into the territory from the east on day 69, moving through the tree line at the specific, careful pace of a wolf that had learned to be cautious about every new piece of ground it crossed. Adult male, gray-white coat, darker patches on the shoulders, moving alone in deep winter, which in wolf terms meant either very dangerous or very desperate, and the line between those was thin. Moving alone, which in wolf terms was a significant data point because wolves alone in winter in territory this cold were either very dangerous or very desperate, and the line between those two categories was thinner than it looked from the outside, and I had been in this world long enough to know that thin lines mattered. I picked him up on the passive scan at 300 meters and tracked him for 20 minutes before I had enough data to make a preliminary assessment. He was not hunting. He was not marking. He was moving in a direction that would take him past the den without approaching it, using the terrain features the way someone uses terrain when they're trying to get somewhere without being noticed along the way. He was passing through, or trying to. Mother picked up his scent at the same moment I did, and her reaction was immediate and unambiguous. She placed herself between the den entrance and the direction he was coming from, shoulders lowered, communicating without sound the specific message that this territory was occupied and the occupant was not into. She was communicating that this territory was occupied and the occupant was not currently interested in any form of discussion about that fact. Brick was on his feet 2 seconds later, aligned behind Mother, adding his weight to the message. I stayed where I was and watched Ash's response to what he was receiving from the territory boundary. He stopped. He sat down in the snow approximately 60 meters from the tree line, which put him in a position that was simultaneously visible and non-threatening. A posture that said, "I know you are there and I am not trying." He was not hiding that he knew they were there, and he was not approaching, and in wolf language, those two things together meant something specific and deliberate. That was interesting. A desperate wolf trying to push through territory it had found occupied would not sit down calmly at 60 meters. A dangerous wolf would not telegraph its position and wait. Ash was doing something else, something that read, in the body language I had been studying for 69 days, as a request for conversation rather than a confrontation. I moved to the den entrance and looked at Mother. She looked at me, then she looked at Ash, then she looked back at me with the expression I had learned to translate as, "Your call, but explain it to me afterward." I walked out of the den. Brick made a sound behind me that I elected to categorize as concern rather than objection. The distinction mattered for how I was going to manage his reaction later. I crossed the clearing toward Ash at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, watching his response to my approach the entire way. He stayed seated. His weight remained back. His ears stayed at neutral rather than forward or flat. Everything about his posture was consistent with his initial signal. He was not recalibrating toward aggression as I got closer. He was waiting. I stopped 5 meters from him. We looked at each other. He was older than I had initially assessed from the scan data. The fur around his muzzle carried the lightening that came with age. He had a healed scar running along his left flank, old enough to be invisible under the grown-in fur unless you were close enough to see the slight variation in texture. He had survived things. That was the information his body carried. Then he did something I had not seen any wolf do since I arrived in this world. He looked directly at me with the specific focused attention of an animal that was looking at something it had been looking for. And he made a sound that was not any of the sounds I had cataloged in 69 DAs of living inside a wolf pack. It was low, deliberate, structured in a way that regular wolf communication was not structured. The system responded immediately. Alert. Entity in proximity is emitting a curse frequency signal. Classification, compatible bloodline. Note, cursed bloodlines can detect each other through the resonance output. This entity has been tracking your signal. Compatible bloodline. Not the same as mine. The system was careful about that. Compatible, not identical. But something in the frequency of what he was, whatever he carried in him that was adjacent to what I carried in me, had been tracking the resonance output I had been producing without fully understanding how much. The resonance signal I had been producing without fully understanding how much output I was generating had been enough for him to find me across whatever distance he had covered to get here. He had found me on purpose. He had been tracking my resonance output specifically, and he had arrived and sat down at 60 meters instead of disappearing into the trees. That required a response. I looked at him for a long time. He looked back with the patience of something that had traveled far enough to get here that it was willing to wait for me to process whatever I needed to process. I thought about the system's warning. Compatible bloodline. Something that could detect me. Something that had tracked my signal and chosen to approach rather than report it. The survey team had found me by accident, or more precisely by following a tip from the thing to the north. Ash had found me by following the signal itself, directly, without intermediary. That meant two things. One, my resonance output was broader than I had accounted for in my original evasion planning. Two, whatever had found me was not automatically an enemy, because an enemy with this kind of tracking capability would not have announced its presence at 60 meters with a calm sit-down. I made a decision that felt like the kind of decision that changes the shape of everything that comes after it. I walked the remaining 5 meters and sat down in front of him. He looked at me for 3 full seconds. Then he made that structured sound again, and this time the system offered me something it had not offered before. Translation assistance activated, curse resonance communication detected. The system can provide approximate translation of resonance-based communication between compatible bloodlines. I almost laughed. The system had been sitting on a translation feature and had not mentioned it for 69 days. The translation came in fragments, not clean sentences, more like the emotional and intentional content of what was being communicated, filtered through whatever process the system used to render it in terms my human brain could parse. The first thing Ash communicated was something that translated approximately as, "You are young, and you do not know what you're carrying, and that is going to get you and everyone near you killed," which was rude, also accurate. The second thing he communicated was something that translated as, "I have been where you are. I know what the awakening feels like from the inside. I can help you not die from it if you are willing to listen to something that does not come with a system window attached." I sat in the snow across from this old, scarred wolf with whatever he was carrying in him, in the silence of a frozen forest at level 2, with a curse that was actively trying to wake up and kill me through the... I sat with that and thought about what trusting someone cost when you were level 2 and extinct and running on 93% suppression with a strike team inbound. In my previous life, I had been bad at trusting people. I had been good at analyzing systems, and bad at the version of trust that required you to extend something before you had all the data. But I was also smart enough to recognize when the data available was sufficient to act on, and the data I had on Ash pointed in one clear direction. And the data I had on Ash said, "Old survived, found me by tracking my signal, approached without aggression, communicated with intent rather than threat, and offered information about the awakening process that the system had been conspicuously vague about. The math on trusting him was better than the math on not trusting him. That was the only calculation I had available. I made the sound that, in the 69 days of vocabulary I had built, was the closest thing I had to. I am listening. What Ash showed me over the next 3 days reorganized everything I thought I understood about what I was carrying inside this body and what it meant to carry it. The controlled expression the system had recommended was real, but the system had not told me what expression actually meant in practice, because expression was not a setting you adjusted. It was a relationship you developed. The curse was not a tool. It was not separate from me in the way a locked ability was separate from the rest of a character sheet. It was more fundamental than that. Ash demonstrated this in a way that did not require translation, which was efficient and also suggested he had explained it to someone before and knew how to do it clearly. He found a section of the forest where the cold had killed a stand of trees, leaving them standing but hollow, no life remaining in them, just the structural memory of what they had been. He touched the bark of one dead tree with his nose and then looked at me, and the look said, "Pay attention to what you feel right now, not what you think you should feel." I moved closer. I could feel it even before I was close enough to touch. The absence in the dead wood, the place where life had been and was no longer. And beneath that absence, something in me was responding to it in a way I had not noticed before, because I had not known what to pay attention to. The curse felt the differential, the gap between what something had been and what it currently was, and it moved toward that gap with the direction of something that had always known exactly what gaps were for. And it moved toward that gap with the specific directed attention of something that understood exactly what differentials meant and what to do with them. Ash's communication came through the system in fragments. This is what expression feels like when there is nothing dangerous in the target. Practice with absence before you practice with presence. Learn the feeling before you need the function. I touched the dead tree. The feeling that came through was not what I expected. I had been imagining something aggressive, something that seized and consumed and took by force, which was the way the lore entry had described it, and the way the Hunter Guild records had characterized it. What I actually felt was more like completing a circuit. The gap in the dead wood and the something in me, they were oriented toward each other in a way that required no force at all. It was simply movement along a gradient that already existed. Water finding its level, electricity finding its ground. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, just a very quiet click of connection, followed by the smallest possible increase in the warmth inside me, and then the system notification. Micro-expression event detected. Curse, seal integrity, 94.8%. XP gained consumption. Passive awakening, 0.3%. 0.3% on the consumption passive. But it was there. It was real. The ability that had been locked behind a wall since day one had moved, by a fraction of a fraction, because I had let it move instead of fighting it. Ash looked at me with those old eyes, and the translation came through as something like, "There it is. Now you know what it feels like. Don't rush it. The rushing is what kills them." I sat with that for a while. Them, the 94% that had tried to suppress or rush the awakening and had not survived it. The specimens the Hunter Guilds had found before they could reach whatever threshold Ash had apparently reached. The threshold that let you sit calmly at 60 meters in someone else's territory and communicate Tihu resonance frequency like it was a completely normal thing to do. I asked him, through the closest approximation of resonance communication I could manage, how he had survived his own awakening. The answer came back in fragments, assembled over several minutes into something I could work with, and what it told me changed how I understood everything else I had learned so far. He had survived because someone had shown him what I had just done. Before the suppression became lethal and before the unsuppressed curse became catastrophic, someone had taught him the middle path. Controlled expression through graduated practice, small differentials first, larger ones as the capacity developed, never forcing the pace faster than the seal could safely accommodate. The person who had shown him was gone now, a long time gone, and Ash had spent years since then looking for whatever the resonance output told him was the next iteration of what he carried, which was me. I was apparently the next Cursed Dire Wolf, not because of any plan or bloodline succession or anything organized, just because the curse existed in the world and the world was large and occasionally it found a new body to carry it forward. Ash had found me before the Hunter Guilds had found me with their upgraded equipment. That timing was the most important fact in every calculation I was running. The system updated while I was processing all of this, arriving with the specific timing of information that knows it is about to make your immediate situation significantly more complicated. Alert, Hunter Guild, signal detected. Location, 6.2 kilometers east. Classification, strike team deployment. Personnel count, estimated 8 to 12. Equipment grade, high sensitivity. Timeline to arrival at current position, 4 to 6 hours. There it was. The follow-up to the survey report. Not a second survey team. A strike team, 8 to 12 people with the equipment that the previous survey team had not been carrying, the equipment that would not log me as Category C wildlife when it swept through the forest. 4 to 6 hours. I looked at Ash, and the translation came back immediately. They are faster than I expected, and we need to move the pack right now. The translation that came back was reading the same data from the resonance signals in the air, because whatever he carried let him detect human presence in the same way I was detecting it through the system. His communication came through as, "They are faster than I expected. We need to move the pack now," which was exactly what I had already concluded, but was useful to have confirmed. The "we" was interesting. He had been in this territory for 3 days and was already using "we." I chose to take that as a sign of commitment rather than presumption. I went back to the den at a pace that was not quite running, but was the specific fast trot of an animal communicating urgency without panic, because panic in a pack was contagious and I needed the pack functional, not reactive. Mother read my approach the moment I cleared the tree line. She was on her feet before I reached the den entrance, reading everything my body was communicating about the level of urgency involved. Ash followed me in at the edge of my sight line, staying back enough to let Mother process my return before she had to process the additional presence, which was exactly the right call and told me something useful. That restraint confirmed something about how well he understood pack dynamics from the outside, and it moved him up in my assessment of the situation. I looked at Mother and communicated the only way I could, by moving toward the route I had identified and looking back at her, which in wolf language was less a request and more a statement. I went to the back of the den, picked up the direction of the route I had identified 6 weeks ago as the best emergency exit, and looked back at her. She hesitated for 2 seconds. Mother hesitated for 2 full seconds, which was the longest I had ever seen her pause before a decision, because in 2 seconds, a wolf can read an enormous amount of information from another wolf's body. Whatever she read in my posture and my movement and the 69 days of behavior that had preceded this moment, she made her decision. She moved. Brick followed immediately, which surprised me. I had expected argument, or at least the 3-second delay of an animal that needed to feel like it was choosing rather than being led. He moved right behind Mother with the efficiency of something that had finally found a situation it understood without ambiguity. The 2 younger pups were scooped up before they were fully awake, Mother carrying one, the other following on instinct before it had time to decide whether it wanted to. We moved northwest, away from the strike team's direction, away from both den sites that the survey report might have flagged, and toward the valley I had not yet told anyone about. Away from both den sites, the original and the rock formation, because if the survey team's report had been specific enough, both of those locations were already compromised in terms of the information the strike away from both locations that the survey report had potentially flagged, because if the report had been specific, both of them were already known to whoever was carrying that high sensitivity equipment. Ash fell into position at the rear of the group, which was the correct position for a new addition moving through someone else's territory, and he held it without being asked to, which continued to be consistent. The absence of contest told me something that felt more important than any formal acknowledgement could have. Something about what 69 days of consistent behavior actually communicated to a pack. I ran point, which had not been a formal arrangement in this pack until this moment, but which no one contested. And that absence of contest told me something useful about how far 69 days had taken us. The route I had selected went through 3 terrain features I had chosen for specific defensive reasons. 6 weeks ago, when I had still been treating the strike team as a theoretical future problem, rather than so, mething 4 to 6 hours away. The first was a section of rocky ground that ran for approximately 400 meters, where the stone was too hard and too irregular to hold clean tracks. Anything following us through there would be reading disturbance patterns rather than clear prints, which was harder to follow and easier to misread. The second was a frozen stream crossing at a point where the ice was thick enough to hold the pack's weight, but the water beneath still moved, which would disrupt ground-based vibration tracking for anyone following our path on that technology. The third was a specific hillside where the wind came down from the north at an angle that carried our scent away from the direction we were moving. Anyone tracking by scent from behind us would be following a trail that bent in the wrong direction. None of these 3 features made us invisible. That was not the goal. The goal was to make us expensive to track, to increase the cost and time and effort of following our route, to turn 4 to 6 hours into more time than that. The system updated as we cleared the rocky section. Evasion, route assessment, effective. Estimated tracking delay imposed on strike team, 2 to 3 additional hours. Revised timeline to contact, 6 to 9 hours. Note, high sensitivity. Equipment reduces the effectiveness of physical evasion. Measures at close range, the system always delivered the limitation after the good news, which I had started to expect. 6 to 9 hours, better than 4 to 6. Not enough to feel comfortable about, but enough to reach the destination I had in mind. The destination was something I had found on a solo run 11 days ago, and had not told anyone about because at the time I had not known what to do with it, and had not wanted to draw attention to it. It was a valley. Small, sheltered on 3 sides by ridgelines that created a natural windbreak and a natural obstacle to anything approaching from those directions. The 4th side opened south toward lower ground, where prey would be moving toward in the spring, which was still weeks away but would become relevant if we were staying anywhere for longer than a short-term emiry. The fourth side of the valley opened south toward lower ground, where prey would begin moving as the season shifted, which was still weeks away but would matter considerably if we were staying long term. The floor of the valley had a water source that did not freeze fully even in the deepest cold, which was the detail that had made me flag it and remember it. Running water meant prey came to it. Prey that came to it consistently meant a hunting resource that did not require long-range expeditions. Long-range expeditions were dangerous when a strike team was in the territory. There was one more thing about the valley that I had not told the system and the system had not mentioned, which was either because it did not know or because it was waiting for me to discover it myself. The valley's rock formation on the northern ridgeline had a specific composition I had noticed when I ran the passive scan across it on my scouting trip. The mineral content in the stone produced a background interference pattern in the resonance frequency range. Not total suppression, not invisibility, but a consistent low-level static in the exact frequency band that Cursed resonance operated on, which meant any directional sensor trying to get a clean reading on my position from outside the valley would be H-ting interference that the terrain itself was generating. Natural resonance camouflage. I had not been sure if the system would classify it the same way I had classified it. When we cleared the second terrain feature, and I pushed the destination into focus in my planning calculations, the system updated. Destination, analysis, resonance, interference rating, high detection probability. From outside valley with standard high sensitivity equipment, 23%. Detection, probability with military grade equipment, 61%. 23% detection probability from outside, with the equipment a standard strike team carried. That was workable. That was the kind of number you could operate inside for long enough to reach the next threshold. We reached the valley 4 hours after leaving the den. The pack moved into the sheltered floor and immediately began the process of adjusting to new space, reading everything, establishing the familiar signals of habitation in an unfamiliar place. Mother found the water source in under 10 minutes and checked it with the thoroughness of an animal that understood water in winter was a resource worth being thorough about. Brick explored the perimeter with a systematic attention I had not seen him apply to anything before, which suggested that the urgency of the move had activated something in him that normal den life did not, and that willingness to patrol without being asked, applied to a space he had arrived in hours earlier, was useful information about how to work with him going forward. Ash settled near the valley entrance with his back to the rock face and his eyes on the approach, which was exactly the right position for the security function, and confirmed that he understood his role in the Q rent situation without needing to be told what it was. I stood in the center of the valley and let the passive scan run. The resonance interference was real, and it was exactly what I had assessed. My own signal, which I had been managing with the seal and which Ash had been helping me modulate with the controlled expression practice, blurred at the valley edges. Not gone, but blurred. The specific frequency resolution that a directional sensor needed to get a positional fix on me was degraded by the background noise from the stone. The system confirmed it. Passive resonance. Masking active. Effective range of masking, approximately 800 meters from valley center. Note, masking reduces but does not eliminate detection risk. Maintain controlled expression protocols. 800 meters of effective masking. Enough that a strike team arriving at our previous den site and scanning for the signal would not get a clean reading to the valley. They would get a general direction from the region, at best, which was a very different quality of information. I had bought time. Again. Better time than before because this time I had a location advantage and a natural feature working in my favor instead of just my own evasion protocols. The system updated one more time before the light failed and the cold of the valley night settled in around us. Level up. 3. Curse seal, 93%. Shadow step, partially unlocked, 40% detection reduction. During movement, now available, consumption. Passive, 1.2% awakening. Note, at level 3, resonance output increases. The strike team's equipment will detect you more easily than it detected you at level 2. Note, this is not a reason to stop leveling. It is a reason to move faster. Level 3, Shadow Step partially unlocked. The first real ability coming online, even partial, even at 40%, was a different category of tool than everything I had been working with. I looked around the valley. Ash watching the entrance, Mother settling the pups, Brick patrolling a perimeter he had designated himself, the water source running quietly in the cold. This was not the position I would have designed if I had been given a choice, but it was a defensible position. It was a position with tools I had not had yesterday. It was a position inside a natural interference field that was going to make the next 6 to 9 hours very uncomfortable for a strike team that had expected to find something small and unaware and easy to close. On quickly. The system's last note stayed in my vision for a long time. This is not a reason to stop leveling. It is a reason to move faster. I looked at the dark edge of the valley where the ridgeline met the sky and the stars were coming out in the specific density that only happened in places far enough from human light sources to see what the sky. I looked at the edge of the valley where the ridgeline met the sky and the stars were coming out in the specific density that only exists far from any human light source. In my previous life, I had never once stopped to look at stars. Always too busy, always too certain there would be more time for that later. And then later had been a gaming chair and a loading screen. Too convinced there would be more time for that kind of thing later, which there was not, because later had turned out to be a gaming chair and a loading screen and then this. The curse was awake inside me at 5.2% of its actual capacity, and it was already changing the way I processed the world. The strike team was 6 to 9 hours away, and moving toward a position we had already vacated, carrying equipment rated for detecting something that was currently sitting inside a natural interference field. I had one newly unlocked ability and one scarred old wolf and one pack that had followed me into a valley in the dark because something in my behavior over 69 days had convinced them that following me was I needed to be worth the cost of that trust, which meant performing at the level they had decided to bet on, consistently and without the luxury of getting it wrong. I needed to be worth that cost. The valley was quiet and the stars were dense and the pack was settling in around me for the first night in a new place, which meant they had decided this was worth it. Tomorrow, the strike team would arrive at our previous position and find nothing but cold tracks and the beginning of a very expensive trail. And I would be here, in the interference field, learning to move with shadow step and practicing controlled expression with Ash, and figuring out how to turn 6 to 9 hours into something permanent. I had started this second life, falling face first into snow repeatedly, because I could not figure out how 4 legs worked at the same time, which felt like a long time ago from where I was standing now. 69 days later, I was running evasion protocols against a professional strike team, managing a pack, learning to operate a power with no recorded ceiling, and beginning to understand that the 4-minute so, revival estimate the system had printed on day 1 was not a prediction. It was a challenge. And I had never once in either of my lives walked away from a challenge that was actually worth taking seriously. The valley held the cold and the quiet and the sound of the pack settling in around me. Tomorrow was going to be a very different kind of day. The strike team arrived at our old den site at dawn on day 70, and I watched them from 2 kilometers away through the passive scan like someone watching a storm cross a valley they had already left. 8 people. The system had estimated 8 to 12 and landed at the lower end, which was either good news or the sign that whoever sent them was confident 8 was sufficient. They moved with the coordination of a unit that had worked together before, not the loose formation of a survey team. The tight, overlapping coverage was the kind professionals used when they trusted each other's positioning enough to not have to verify it constantly. Whatever she was carrying now was visibly different from the first visit, longer in the barrel and with a different sweep pattern that suggested it required calibration between uses. The kind of device that was built for a specific purpose rather than general survey work told me someone had given her a specific target profile before she left. Whatever she was carrying was visibly different from the first visit, longer, and requiring calibration between uses, the kind built for a specific target profile. She swept the old den site for 11 minutes. I counted each pass. Then she looked north. Not toward the valley, not directly, but in the general quadrant that contained it. She held that direction for a long time, making adjustments to the device I could not identify from this distance. The system updated. I closed my eyes, which was not something I needed to do for the resonance process, but which helped me concentrate on what I was trying to do. Working the output down was more like managing breath than controlling a switch, and having done it wrong once already, I was careful about how I approached it now. Recommend reducing resonance. Output below current level immediately, 19% per sweep. Extended duration means cumulative risk. She had been holding that direction for 4 minutes already. I closed my eyes and worked on the resonance output the way Ash had been teaching me, not suppressing it, but reducing the surface area it pushed through. Not suppression. Suppression was the wrong direction, the 94% direction. What I was doing was more like breathing, pulling the expression in, not stopping it, just reducing the surface area it was pushing through, the way you reduce a flame without extinguishing it. The system updated after 40 seconds. Resonance output, reduced by 31%. Current detection probability, 11%. The woman with the sensor held the direction for another 2 minutes. Then she turned and said something to the team leader, a large man in dark tactical gear who had been standing at the den entrance reading a physical document. He looked at the direction she had indicated. He looked at his document. He said something back. She adjusted the device and swept the entire northern quadrant one more time. 11%. I held the reduced output and did not move and did not let myself think about what 11% meant in terms of what happened next. Ash was waiting at the entrance in the position he had held every morning since we arrived, back to the rock face, eyes on the approach. He looked at me when I returned and sent a translation immediately. They are at the old site, working it for most of the day, and they did not get a clean fix on this position. The team leader made a hand signal. 3 members of the team began a systematic ground search of the den site and the immediate surrounding area. The other 4 spread out in a perimeter formation. They were not leaving. They were settling in to work the site thoroughly. I pulled back from the scan and returned to the valley. Ash was at the entrance in his usual position when I returned, back to the rock face, eyes on the approach, reading the same data I had been reading through a different instrument. He looked at me when I returned and the translation came through immediately. They are at the old site. They will work it for most of the day. They did not get a clean fix on this position. He communicated the last part with a specific weight of information that has been confirmed rather than assumed, which told me his detection capability extended further than I had initially assessed. I sat down beside him and looked at the valley, at the pack moving through the morning in the rhythm 9 days of occupation had established. The pack was moving through the morning in the rhythm they had established over 9 days of occupation. Mother had taken the 2 younger pups toward the water source. Brick was on the western ridge, doing the perimeter patrol he had started on day 2 without being asked, and had maintained every morning since. 9 days. The pack had been in this valley for 9 days, and it had already stopped feeling like emergency shelter and started feeling like something else. That was either comfort or complacency, and I needed to know which one it was. The system had a thought on that. Behavioral note: pack integration of secondary location is proceeding normally. Normal integration is a risk factor when the reason for relocation has not been resolved. The strike team has not departed. The entity to the north has not been identified. The threat condition has not changed, it has only become familiar. I appreciated the system's commitment to maintaining my anxiety at productive levels. The threat had not changed. It had become familiar. The communication I sent was approximate, as all my resonance attempts still were, more directional than precise in its construction. But Ash had proven consistently good at interpreting what I was reaching toward, even when my execution left significant gaps in the precision. I looked at Ash. He was still watching the approach, which was both his default state and, in this specific moment, information about what the approach currently contained. The guilds used a different method then, a specific device designed for cursed bloodline detection that they developed after the first purge. Several specimens had survived the initial sweep methods by staying mobile, so the guilds built something that worked on frequency output rather than physical presence. I asked it now, constructing the resonance communication with the care I had learned was necessary when the question was one I actually needed a precise answer to. The communication I sent was approximate, as all my resonance attempts still were. But Ash had proven good at interpreting the intent, even when the execution left gaps. The question was, what happened to the one who taught you? He held the answer for a while before sending it back, long enough that I started to think he was not going to respond. When it came, the translation arrived in pieces. She was found, before she had finished what she was doing, before the 3rd generation she was preparing for had arrived. The guilds had developed a new device after the first purge, because several specimens had slipped through the original sweep methods by staying mobile rather than territorial. She was found because she was not careful about her output at a moment when she thought she was safe. The translation paused. Then, I survived because she pushed me into a terrain feature that blocked the reading before they got a fix on my position. I did not know, at the time, what she was doing. I understood it later. I sat with that for a long time, working through what it meant that the gap in the old device had been identified and closed by people who were thorough enough to track the gaps at all. In the 11 seconds it took the guild device to distinguish between 2 signals in close proximity, the one that remained in the open was the one the device locked onto. Ash had been watching approaches from den entrances for however many decades had passed since then, and finding me had apparently been the objective that organized all of it. He had found me because I was apparently the 3rd generation she had been preparing for, which was a level of long-term planning that made my own 11-day preparation for the valley feel modest in comparison. The system added a line I had not requested, arriving with the timing of information that knows it is going to change the calculation you just completed. Note: the device Ash described was retired from guild use 47 years ago. The replacement technology is significantly more sensitive. The woman in the strike team is carrying the current generation of that device. Significantly more sensitive. Current generation. The upgrade existed because something had survived the previous generation, and the people responsible for the upgrade knew exactly what that something was. I looked at the northern edge of the valley where the passive scan was still reporting the strike team's position, still at the old den site, still working systematically. They had retired the old device because something had slipped through its gaps, and they had built the replacement with those specific gaps filled. which told me the woman knew exactly what she was looking for. They had made a better one because the old one had gaps in it, and something had survived through those gaps, and they did not intend to have that happen again. Whatever had sent the survey team, whatever had been sitting at the northern edge of my detection range on day 40 and had not come itself, had sent people with the current generation technology. That thing knew what gaps the old technology had. That thing knew where to fill them. I looked at Ash. The question I sent this time was simpler. The entity to the north. I sent the question with as much precision as I could manage. You know what it is. He did not hold this one as long as the previous answer. The translation came back as an old enemy dressed as an ally. Something that was there during the purge and survived it by choosing a side. Something that has been watching for the next iteration of this bloodline for a long time, and has its own reasons for that watch that have nothing to do with protecting what it finds. I ran controlled expression practice with the dead wood in the valley's eastern section for 3 hours, keeping resonance output below 15% detection probability. The consumption passive had reached 2.1% awakening by midday. The gap between 2.1 and 30%, which was the functional threshold, was not small and would not close quickly. Something that had been looking for the next Cursed Dire Wolf for long enough that it had the patience and the resources to send a survey team and then a strike team and wait to see what developed. Not a protector. Not a threat in the obvious sense. Something that wanted me found and assessed before deciding what category I belonged in. Shadow Step worked at 40% efficiency currently, meaning my sensory signature during movement was reduced by roughly 2/5. Not invisible, not even close to invisible, but meaningfully quieter in the resonance frequency range than unaugmented movement, which was the category of improvement that mattered right now. Something that was watching and deciding had objectives that depended on what it decided, which meant the range of possible outcomes was wider and required more variables to plan around. I filed it and moved on because the strike team was more immediate than the entity to the north, and I could only manage one category of problem at a time. The day passed slowly. By midday, the consumption passive had reached 2.1% awakening, which was real progress at a pace that required patience I had not yet been seriously tested on. The progress was real but slow, and by midday, the consumption passive had reached 2.1% awakening, which was accurate and was also the kind of number that required patience I had not been tested on yet. By the system's calculations, I needed it at roughly 30% before the larger abilities in that tree started becoming functionally useful. The gap between 2.1 and 30 was not small. Shadow Step, which had partially unlocked at level 3, was a different story. Shadow Step worked at 40% efficiency, meaning my movement signature in the resonance frequency range was reduced by roughly 2/5, meaningfully quieter, but not invisible. I had been practicing it in the valley for 9 days. The sensation of it was unlike anything in my previous life's experience, and also unlike anything I had imagined based on the description. Moving with Shadow Step active was not like moving in shadow. It was something more like occupying the space between one moment and the next, present but registered differently. It was more like moving in the space between one moment and the next, the gap between a sound and its echo, something that the world registered less as a presence and more as a recently vacated absence. I had practiced it enough to hold it for approximately 4 minutes at a time, before the effort of maintaining it overcame the benefit of having it active. That threshold was improving, but slowly, in the way physical training improves when you are also spending significant resources on keeping yourself alive at the same time. Ash watched me practice without commentary, which I had learned was his version of approval. Commentary from Ash meant correction. Silence meant, "Continue, you're not dying, that is sufficient for now." The system updated at mid-afternoon, arriving with a specific timing of information that knows it is about to make the situation more complicated than it was 30 seconds ago. Strike team movement detected. Team is relocating from old den site. New direction, southwest. Note: southwest trajectory does not lead directly to valley. It leads to the secondary den site at the rock formation. They had found the rock formation, either from the survey team's report or from their own ground reading of the tracks that led away from the old den. The rock formation was the obvious secondary location for a pack that had been pushed out of a primary den. Any experienced tracker would check it. They would find the formation empty. We had been gone for 9 days, and the cold had reduced the fresh scent signature considerably. But they would be able to tell it had been recently occupied, and they would be able to tell the occupying group had left in a specific direction. The question was, how specific? The system answered before I asked. Estimated directional information. Available from rock formation site. General Northwest. This is consistent with 3 possible destination zones. The valley is one of them. Probability that the strike team investigates this valley within 48 hours. 34%, 34%. That was no longer the kind of probability you could operate comfortably inside for an extended period. 34% in 48 hours meant that if we stayed in this valley without changing anything, we were making a bet with roughly 1 in 3 odds on losing it within 2 days. I went to find Ash. He was already moving when I found him, which meant he had read the same information from the environmental signals and had reached the same conclusion without waiting for me to confirm it. His communication was direct. We cannot stay here the way we have been staying here. I sent back, agreed. What we need is a way to be here without being here. Brick's patrol had been ranging to the valley edges and beyond, which was natural for an animal establishing territory. From a signals perspective, it was broadcasting our presence in exactly the frequency band and direction that the upgraded equipment was calibrated to read, which was the opposite of what we needed. Then, explain. I thought about how to communicate what I was working through in terms that would translate through resonance rather than requiring language. The problem was presence. If we were in the valley, we were producing signals, track signatures, biological waste markers, water source disturbance patterns, the 100 small signs that a professional team was trained to read. Moving the pack out of the valley reduced those signs, but also gave up the resonance masking that made the valley worth staying in. The solution, if there was one, was to reduce our presence signature without reducing our actual presence, to be in the valley in a way that read as smaller and less significant than what we were, to be in the valley in a way that read, from the outside, as something smaller and less significant than what we actually were. The system had a thought. Resonance. Masking effectiveness is currently dependent on pack proximity to the valley center. Pack members, positioned at the valley perimeter, produce signal leakage beyond the masking field, reducing pack distribution. Radius by 60% would improve masking effectiveness by approximately 28%. Tighter clustering, less perimeter exposure. Brick's patrol had been ranging to the valley edges and beyond, which, from a signals perspective, was broadcasting our position in exactly the frequency band the upgraded equipment was calibrated for. And the hunting. Mother had been ranging up to 1 kilometer from the valley center to find sufficient prey for a pack that included 4 growing pups and 2 adults in hard winter. 1 kilometer of hunting range meant 1 kilometer of track signature, scent trails, prey disturbance patterns. A trained team with the right equipment could read that as easily as a map. Ice in this context was not alive, but it carried a different kind of energy, the compressed potential of water in a suspended state. I had been feeling it on the passive scan for 9 days without the vocabulary to name what I was sensing, and the practice with the deadwood had given me that vocabulary. He considered it. Then, the pups need food. 500 meters in this valley at this time of year will not support the pack long. That was the problem. The solution that worked for the evasion objective made the survival objective harder. The solution that worked for survival expanded the signature that made evasion harder. I thought about it for a while, and then I went to work on the consumption passive instead, because sometimes the answer to an impossible constraint is to remove the constraint rather than optimize within it. Ash had said, practice with absence before you practice with presence. Learn the feeling before you need the function. The dead trees in the eastern section had been absence practice, taking from things that had no remaining life to resist the process. The consumption passive worked on differentials. The larger the differential, the more efficient the process. Deadwood had almost 0 life energy remaining, which made it a small differential and a small yield. It had been useful for learning the sensation and for the micro gains in the consumption awakening percentage, which meant every time I had planned to practice on living targets, I would have produced a signal the upgraded device was specifically built to read at range. That was information that would have been extremely useful to have before making those plans, and I stored a note about asking better questions of the system before committing to training schedules. Ice, in this context, carried the compressed potential of water in a suspended state, and I had been sensing it on the passive scan for 9 days without vocabulary to name what I was feeling. I went to the ice formation now with a clearer framework for understanding what the passive scan had been feeling for 9 days without the vocabulary to name it. I spent the next 6 hours working through every non-biological differential the passive scan could locate inside the 500-meter radius. At each source, the yield was small, and the system measured the gain in fractions, but fractions accumulated over 6 hours of focused practice into a number the system eventually recognized as a threshold. The curse, which moved toward differentials, could feel the direction that energy wanted to move. I touched the ice formation. What came through was colder and more expansive than the dead tree feeling. Not warm the way biological consumption felt, not the circuit-completing sensation from the eastern section. Something more like unlocking, like a pressure that had been held in one configuration, suddenly finding a configuration it preferred. The system updated. Consumption. Passive. Non-biological absorption event. Thermodynamic energy. Differential detected and processed. Awakening percentage, 3.7%. Note, non-biological absorption. Yields are lower than biological yields, but carry no detection risk from the resonance signal perspective. Standard biological consumption. Events produce a distinct resonance spike detectable at range. I stared at that last line. Biological consumption produced a detectable spike, which meant every time I had been practicing consumption, I would have produced a signal the woman's device was specifically calibrated to detect. And I had been about to start doing exactly that. The system had not told me that, or I had not asked the right question to receive it. Either way, knowing it now changed the next several hours of decisions. I gathered the pack before dark, using the tightest signal I could manage, the equivalent of a quiet voice in a small room. Mother understood immediately and complied without questioning the change in routine. That told me either she trusted the judgment behind it, or she had read enough from the environment to reach the same conclusion independently, and with Mother, those two things were sometimes identical. It had everything except the speed of progression that biological consumption would have provided. Slower was survivable, detectable was not. I spent the next 6 hours working through every non-biological differential inside the 500-meter radius, moving from the ice formation to mineral-rich stone to compressed organic soil. Brick processing before complying was better than Brick complying immediately without thinking, because an animal that follows without processing also stops when something more persuasive than me comes along. An animal that followed orders without processing them also stopped following when the processing of someone more persuasive came along. And Brick was eventually going to encounter someone more persuasive than me. But the sum of fractions, accumulated over 6 hours of focused practice, moved the consumption passive to 7.4% by the time the light failed. Ash watched me work without intervening. When I finally stopped, he came and sat beside me and held a communication that translated as, "You understand something now that you did not understand this morning." I sent back, "That speed and safety are not the same direction," which was a conclusion that had arrived fully formed and which I suspected Ash had been waiting 9 days for me to reach. He made the sound that I had started to understand meant something between agreement and yes, and it took me longer to learn that than it should have. "So you are ahead of where I was," which was the closest thing to encouragement I had received from him in 9 days, so I chose to take it. The system updated at the edge of dark. Strike team position, rock formation site. Team is establishing a temporary camp, estimated duration at site, overnight. Departure direction unknown. Note, team is within 2.1 kilometers of valley entrance. That meant sleeping was now also leveling, which was the most efficient mechanic I had encountered since arriving in this body. The yield was minimal but continuous, which in the arithmetic of long games was often more valuable than large yields that required conditions you could not always guarantee. 2.1 kilometers. That was close. That was close enough that the word uncertain in the system's note about device range was carrying more weight than I wanted it to. I gathered the pack before dark, moving everyone into the central depression of the valley where the rock walls provided maximum resonance interference from the natural mineral composition. I thought about a woman who had pushed Ash into cover and stayed outside it while the device got a fix on her instead of him. She had prepared for a third generation she would not survive to meet, and the preparation she had made was Ash standing at the valley entrance right now watching the approach. The patience of whatever bloodline-adjacent ability let Ash track a resonance signal across distances I still could not measure accurately. He had arrived at the right moment and sat down at 60 meters in the snow, and the timing of that arrival was not coincidence but the result of a plan made before I was born. Brick took longer. He stood at his usual perimeter position for almost 2 minutes after I signaled the consolidation, doing the wolf equivalent of deciding whether the instruction made sense before following it. Then he came in. 2 minutes was acceptable. I had accounted for 2 minutes in my assessment of how long the consolidation would take. Brick processing before complying was better than Brick complying immediately, because an animal that follows without thinking also stops when something more persuasive comes along. Ash took the position closest to the valley entrance, which no one had suggested, and which was exactly where someone with his particular capabilities needed to be. I settled in the center of the group and ran the passive scan through the night in 2-hour rotations. The strike team made no movement after establishing camp. Their fire, small and controlled, the fire of professionals who understood that fire in a search operation was a signal, burned at the absolute minimum necessary to prevent cold casualties and no larger. They were not careless. They were not overconfident. They were 8 professionals with good equipment and a clear objective, and they were 2.1 kilometers from the thing they were looking for. I ran the consumption practice through the small hours, finding every non-biological differential the passive scan could locate inside the 500-meter radius, and working through each one methodically. The system updated at 3 a.m. with a notation I had not seen before. Consumption. Passive threshold reached. 10% awakening. First function. Partially available. Passive absorption of ambient energy. Note, At 10%, passive absorption operates automatically during rest states. Yield is minimal but continuous. Curse, seal, integrity. 91%. Passive absorption during rest. Minimal but continuous. That meant sleeping was now also leveling, which was the most efficient mechanic I had encountered. And the yield was minimal but continuous in the arithmetic way that long games reward. But the reading would not come to them if the source was moving toward them with Shadow Step active, because moving under Shadow Step produced a signature significantly lower than a stationary baseline output. The motion signature of a Shadow Step approach was significantly lower than a stationary source at baseline output, which made the choice between moving and staying have an answer. The rate was accelerating. The system had said that, and I believed it, which meant the next 6% would not take 70 days. I thought about the 94% fatality rate for suppression attempts. I thought about the no recorded ceiling. I thought about the woman who had pushed Ash into cover and stayed outside it, so the device locked onto her instead of him, buying him the time to reach the third generation. She had prepared for this. For someone like me arriving in a situation like this, the preparation she had made was Ash, the knowledge he carried. The patience of whatever bloodline adjacent ability let Ash track a resonance signal across distances I still could not measure, arriving at the right moment without announcing himself. I activated Shadow Steps and felt the world change its texture the way it always did when the ability was running, that quality of existing in the gap between one moment and the next. The morning was dark at the edges and gray at the center, the specific light of early dawn in a deep winter forest. 3 professionals were moving toward me with equipment built to find exactly what I was, and I was moving toward them with 9 days of practice and the first real ability the system had given me access to. I had 9 days of practice, a 40% reduction in my movement signature, a mapped approach route, and the knowledge of where they were while they had no knowledge that anything was moving in their direction. In my previous life, I had logged 14,000 hours across games where the stealth mechanic was the difference between a successful run and starting over from the last save point. I was on my feet before the second sentence of the system notification, "Finish processing," which was either good reflexes or the specific anxiety of someone who had been counting the clock all night. Ash was already oriented toward the entrance. He had felt it before the system told me. 3 members, not 8. The other 5 were still at the rock formation camp, which meant this was a scouting extension rather than a full assault, but 3 professionals with the upgraded equipment was still a problem that required immediate attention. I had 47 minutes. I looked at the valley, the pack in the central depression, the resonance masking from the northern ridge, the non-biological energy sources I had mapped overnight, the 10% consumption passive running its new automatic function in the background. Shadow Step at 40% efficiency, the ability that made me quieter in the resonance frequency during movement. I thought about what the woman's device was reading, and what it was not reading, and where the gap between those 2 things was. I had been treating the valley as a position to defend, a place to be inside, while the threat was outside, but positions could also be used from the outside. If 3 members of the strike team were moving toward the valley entrance, they were moving through terrain. I had mapped over 9 days of active scouting. I knew every approach, every sightline, every feature that created a natural choke point in the path between the rock formation camp and the valley. 3 people with a detection device did not need to reach the valley to get a reading if the reading came to them. But the reading would not come to them if the source was moving toward them with Shadow Step active, because the motion signature was significantly lower than a stationary baseline. Ash looked at me. The translation came through as a question rather than a statement, which was unusual enough to confirm he was reading the same calculation and was not certain about the conclusion. I sent back the clearest communication I had managed yet because 9 days of practice had improved my output precision considerably. "I'm going toward them rather than waiting for them to arrive," I sent, "and I will be back in 2 hours. And if I am not, then take the pack north and do not stop for anything." The translation he sent back was not agreement. It was also not refusal. It was something that landed more like, "I have made this kind of decision before. I know what it costs. Make sure you know what you are doing before you commit to it." I looked at the valley one more time, Mother watching me from the central depression, Brick on his feet already, reading the shift in the situation. The 2 younger pups still asleep, which was the best possible information state for them to be in right now. 43 minutes remaining. I activated Shadow Step and felt the world shift its texture the way it always did, that quality of existing in the gap between one moment and the next. I moved toward the valley entrance at the pace Ash had taught me, the pace calibrated to keep the footfall pattern below what the upgraded equipment was designed to register. 42 minutes, and the pack behind me in the valley, and Ash at the entrance watching me go, and the system running its calculations in the background without being asked. I had 9 days of practice, a 40% reduction in my movement signature, a fully mapped approach route, and the advantage of knowing exactly where they were while they had no idea I existed. In my previous life, I'd played games where the stealth mechanic was the deciding factor between a successful run and starting over from the last checkpoint. In those games, I had been very good at stealth. The difference here was that there was no checkpoint. There was only the next 42 minutes and whatever I built inside them and whether it was enough. The trees closed around me and the valley fell behind, and I ran the route I had memorized and did not look back. I had been in situations before where the margin between good and catastrophic was measured in seconds, but those situations had involved loading screens and the option to restart from a checkpoint. This one did not have that option. In the 42 minutes I had before 3 professionals with upgraded detection equipment reached the valley entrance was a countdown that did not pause. I moved through the forest under shadow step at the calibrated pace, the one that kept my footfall pattern below the threshold. The upgraded equipment was designed to register. The passive scan ran on a narrow forward beam, trading range for precision, reading the 3 contacts and updating their positions every 30 seconds, with enough accuracy to maintain the route. They were moving in a standard spread formation, 2 meters of lateral separation between each member, which was the formation that maximized ground coverage at the cost of mutual support response time. That was useful information about how they were thinking operationally, and useful information was the only currency I had available in the next 42 minutes. If something happened to one member, the other 2 needed 3 to 4 seconds to converge rather than 1, which was not a combat variable on my end, but was useful for understanding their operational assumptions. I was not planning a confrontation with them. I was planning something considerably more precise than a confrontation, and considerably less dramatic than what the 4-minute survival estimate might suggest. The terrain between the rock formation camp and the valley entrance had 3 significant features, all of which I had mapped during the 9 days of intensive scouting since we had arrived. The first feature was a section of dense pine growth about 1.3 kilometers from the valley entrance, where the trees forced the 3-person formation to compress to pass through. When the formation compressed, the woman with the detection device would be in closer proximity to the 2 flanking members, adding their biological noise to her readings and degrading directional precision. The second was a ridgeline 200 meters past the pine section where the wind came off the northern face in a specific pattern I had tracked for 9 days. The pattern created a consistent false directional signal in the scent layer that bent anything carried from the east toward the northeast instead of continuing straight north. If I could get my resonance output into that wind layer before they cleared the ridge, the directional component of whatever reading they got would be bent 20 to 30 degrees off the valley's actual bearing. 20 to 30 degrees off the bearing of the valley meant their investigation priority would shift to the northeast rather than the north. Northeast led into terrain that was broken, difficult, and unlikely to produce a productive search result quickly. The third feature was the frozen stream crossing I had used in the original evacuation route, where the water still moved underneath, disrupting ground vibration tracking and breaking the track trail cleanly. If I crossed it after producing the false directional in the wind layer, and before they reached the ridge, my trail would end at the stream and bend toward the northeast. The plan had 3 steps and required precise timing on all 3, which was the kind of plan I liked because precise timing was a variable I could control through preparation. Plan assessment. Step 1. Timing. Window for pine section. Compression. 8 minutes remaining. Step 2. Wind layer. Resonance deposit requires controlled expression event. Detection risk during event elevated. Step 3. Stream crossing. Exit viable if steps. 1 and 2 complete within 12 minutes. Overall. Assessment achievable. Note: controlled expression events produce a brief resonance spike. The woman's device may register the spike before directional distortion takes effect. A brief spike before the distortion took effect. That was the gap in the plan. The device would register the spike, classify it as a Class B anomaly, and the operator would note it and continue without triggering a secondary sweep 92% of the time. A trained operator would stop and run a secondary sweep when the data contained a discrepancy that did not resolve to a simple explanation. A secondary sweep at that range with that equipment had a 31% detection probability on my actual position. According to the system's standing estimates, 31% was too high. I needed to eliminate the spike or make it readable as something other than what it was. I thought about this while covering the distance to the pine section at a pace that left me 5 minutes inside the timing window rather than 8. The spike happened because controlled expression at current development was not fully controllable in its initial moment, and that initial moment was exactly what the upgraded device was calibrated to read. The initial moment of energy movement produced a burst of resonance output before the curse settled into the expression state and the output stabilized. Ash had described this during the practice sessions. He had called it the opening sound, the brief moment before expression became sustainable, and he had said that at higher development levels, the opening sound reduced to the point of indetectability. At my current level of 10.4% consumption awakening, the opening sound was not reduced to indetectability. It was measurable. The woman's device was built to measure exactly this kind of measurable thing, but the opening sound had a characteristic frequency profile. It was a specific shape of resonance output, not the same as the sustained expression that followed it. The sustained expression sounded like what I was. The opening sound, alone and brief, sounded like something else, something smaller, something local. I pulled up the system. What does the opening sound register as to standard detection equipment if the sustained expression does not follow it? The system took 4 seconds longer than usual to respond, which I had learned meant it was pulling from a database rather than from active monitoring. Historical records, isolated opening sound events without subsequent sustained expression have been logged by Guild detection equipment as Class B environmental anomalies. Common misclassification, decay resonance from large biological material, probability of secondary sweep trigger from isolated class. B anomaly, 8%, 8%. That was workable. That was the number I needed. The plan now had a modified step 2. Produce the opening sound of a controlled expression event into the wind layer, then cut the expression before the sustained phase began, which would leave a brief spike with no sustained signal attached. The device would read the spike, classify it as a Class B environmental anomaly, and the operator would note it and continue without triggering a secondary sweep 8% of the time. 92% of the time was the number I needed to keep in the front of the calculation, not the 8%, because optimizing for the failure case made the success case worse. The problem with the modification was that cutting a controlled expression event before the sustained phase required a level of precision I had not yet practiced. I had spent 9 days practicing starting expression events and maintaining them. I had not practiced stopping them mid-process. Ash had mentioned this once in a way that suggested stopping mid-process was something I should not attempt until I had significantly more development in the consumption passive. I thought about the 92% success rate versus the 31% detection probability if I did not attempt it. I reached the pine section with 3 minutes to spare. I stopped at the edge of the compression zone and oriented myself toward the ridge and the wind layer above it. The 3 contacts were 1 minute 40 seconds behind me, based on the passive scan, which was enough time and not much more than enough time. I built the expression event in the way Ash had taught me, the gathering of attention on the differential rather than the forcing of movement, the orientation toward the gap rather than the push through it. The opening sound began, and I cut it before the sustained phase could follow, which was the technique Ash had said not to attempt, and which I was now committed to. The sensation of cutting a controlled expression mid-process was like interrupting a sneeze through a combination of physical and mental effort that did not map to anything in my previous experience. The opening sound stopped. The resonance spike was in the wind layer before I had confirmed the stop was clean. The system updated. Controlled expression event terminated early. Resonance spike deposited in wind layer. Directional component, northeast bias active. Class B anomaly, signature, confirmed. Note, early termination of expression. Events carries risks at current development level. Monitoring for adverse effects. Monitoring for adverse effects. That was a phrase I filed for later consideration, because I had 90 seconds before the team reached the compression zone, and later was when I had time for it. I moved through the compression zone while the formation was still 60 meters from the entrance. Shadow step active, pace calibrated. Every footfall placed with the deliberate care of 9 days of practice, through the compression zone, up the near side of the ridge, over the crest, and down to the stream crossing, covering each section at the pace the timing required. The stream was exactly where the map said it was. The ice held. The water moved underneath in the specific pattern I had memorized. I crossed at the narrowest point and moved 15 meters up the far bank before stopping. I looked back at the crossing. Clean break. No track trail continuing from the far bank in any direction except the 15 meters I had just walked. The stream disrupted the vibration continuity. The wind layer above the ridge was carrying the bent signal northeast, and the stream had broken the track trail, and the passive scan confirmed the formation was at the Pine compression zone. Strike team at Pine compression zone. Formation compressing as projected. Detection device, reading in progress, Class B anomaly. Registered, secondary sweep, not triggered. Team continuing forward. Directional heading, northeast. Note, team is no longer on a trajectory toward the valley. Not triggered, northeast heading. I stood at the stream bank in the early morning cold and let myself have exactly 10 seconds of something that felt like relief before I moved back toward the valley. The system sent one more update while I was crossing back toward the valley, arriving with the timing of information that knew I had already made the decision it was commenting on. Note, adverse effect from early expression termination. Detected consumption. Passive awakening has decreased by 0.6%. Current level, 9.8%. Note, this is temporary. Full recovery. Expected within 48 hours. Note, do not repeat this technique within the recovery window. That last line was the one I filed most carefully. Lost 0.6%. Temporary. I had spent 6 hours accumulating 7.4% and lost 0.6 of it in a 30-second emergency maneuver. The math was uncomfortable but survivable. I was back in the valley with 31 minutes remaining on the original 42. Ash looked at me from the entrance position and sent a translation that arrived as, "You are back earlier than I expected." I sent back, "The plan worked. 92% of the time. We got the 92. He was silent for a moment. Then, "And the other 8%. I settled beside him at the entrance. We had bought more time and the cost had been manageable, and I was back where I needed to be, and the consumption passive would recover in 48 hours, and none of this was yet solved. The other 8% is why I'm going to keep practicing," I sent back. And Ash made the sound that meant something between agreement and, yes, that is exactly the right answer. He made the sound that meant something between agreement and, that is the correct answer. And I will pretend you arrived at it faster than I did when I was where you are. Which was the closest thing to a compliment Ash had produced in 11 days. And I chose to take it and not examine it too closely in case it dissolved under analysis. The day that followed was the strangest kind of day I had experienced since arriving in this world. Externally quiet, internally complicated. The strike team spent 8 hours in the northeast quadrant. I tracked them on the passive scan from the valley center, watching their search pattern move through terrain that had nothing significant to find. They were thorough. They were patient. They covered ground with the systematic efficiency of professionals who had done this before and knew that insufficient coverage was the same as no coverage. But they were searching the wrong quadrant, and the equipment designed to find me was finding nothing, because I was 2.5 kilometers away inside a resonance interference field. At hour 6 of their search, the woman stopped in a specific location and held her device stationary for 11 minutes. I felt it on the passive scan as a change in the background noise of the frequency band her equipment operated on. Not a sweep, a sustained read. She was not scanning. She was listening. For 11 minutes, she stood in the wrong quadrant with her device pointed at the ground and listened to whatever the instrument was telling her about the environment she was standing in. Then, she walked back to the formation leader and showed him the device display. He looked at it for a long time. Then, he took out his own instrument, smaller, different type, held it in a specific direction. Not northeast. North. My resonance output dropped to the minimum I could maintain while remaining functional before I had consciously made the decision to reduce it. The wolf body had processed the threat before the analytical brain had finished the sentence. The system updated. Alert. Strike team leader is using a secondary device. Classification, long-range baseline mapper. This device does not read current resonance output. It reads residual resonance impressions left in terrain by sustained presence over time. Your 9 days of habitation in this valley have left a residual impression in the terrain. Estimated reading quality at current distance, low. Estimated reading quality. If team advances 500 meters, moderate. Estimated reading quality if team advances to 1 kilometer, high. Residual impressions. 9 days of habitation had left traces in the terrain itself, the specific frequency signature of extended cursed dire wolf presence embedded in the rock and soil and ice of this valley. The Class B anomaly misdirection had worked on the active scan. The wind layer had bent the directional component northeast. I had built a plan around equipment I understood, and the team was now deploying equipment I had not known to account for. I looked at Ash. His eyes were already on the northern approach. He sent a translation before I could form a question. I did not know they had developed that technology. It was not available during my experience. This changes the calculation significantly. That was the most direct admission of incomplete information Ash had produced in 11 days. And the fact that he led with it rather than a recommendation told me he was recalibrating without a prepared answer. The team leader was still pointing his device north. He said something to the woman. She adjusted her device and pointed it north as well. 2 devices now, one reading residual impression and one reading current output, and the valley's resonance interference only degraded one of those 2 frequencies. The valley's resonance interference would degrade the current output reading, but the residual impression device worked on a different frequency band that the natural mineral composition did not interfere with. The system had been quiet for 30 seconds, which was unusual and meant it was processing something that required more than immediate pattern matching to classify. Revised detection. Probability. Residual mapper at current distance, 12%. If team advances 800 meters north, 47%. If team advances 1.5 kilometers north, 71%. Time for team to advance. 1.5 kilometers at current pace, 23 minutes. 23 minutes to 71% detection. The misdirection had bought hours. The residual mapper had cut those hours down to 23 minutes. I thought faster than I had thought about anything since arriving in this world. Option 1 was to move the pack immediately, abandon the valley and everything the 9 days of preparation had built, and accept what that told the team about how aware they were dealing with. Abandon the valley and everything the 9 days of preparation had built, and run northwest, and accept what that told the team about the level of awareness they were dealing with. The residual impression would lead them here. They would find an empty valley, and the timing gap between their instruments pointing north and our departure would tell them exactly how aware they were dealing with. Option 2, stay. Hold the reduced output. Trust the resonance interference. Accept the 71% probability as the operational environment and find a way to work inside it. Option 3 was something I had not fully formed yet, and the system was not offering it, and Ash was watching the northern approach with the stillness of something that had already run the calculation. I looked at the valley. 9 days of preparation. The water source, the interference field. The pack settled into this space in the way packs settle when they have stopped treating a place as temporary. Then I looked at the consumption passive at 9.8%, and at the gap between that and 25%, and at the 18 minutes I had before the baseline mapper hit moderate quality readings. And I thought about what the residual mapper was reading. It was reading the signature of 9 days of extended presence, the frequency profile of a cursed dire wolf existing in a place over time. It was reading me specifically, my specific frequency profile, the one the Great Purge had been designed to detect and eliminate. And it was doing that because I had been here, staying, accumulating the kind of residual signature that a stationary presence produced when it had been in one place long enough. The curse was not stationary. That was in the lore entry on day 1. The curse accumulated through consumption and movement and engagement. It had never been designed for prolonged habitation. The cursed dire wolves of 2 centuries ago had been nomadic, moving and consuming and growing, never staying long enough to leave the kind of residual signature a baseline mapper could read from kilometers away. I had been playing this like a survival game where finding a good base location and fortifying it was the correct strategy. The correct strategy for what I was had always been movement, and I had been playing a game that rewarded base building in a context that punished the residual signatures base building left behind. He turned from the entrance and looked at me with the specific attention he reserved for moments when I said something that was either very right or very wrong, and he had not yet determined which. I continued, "The residual impression is because we stayed. We should not have stayed. Not for 9 days. The curse does not accumulate residual signature as fast when it is moving. The translation that came back was measured. True. Also, you needed the time to develop. The 9 days were not wasted. But you are correct that what worked for development does not work for indefinite concealment. So the 9 days had been necessary, and also the reason the baseline mapper was now pointing north at us. Both things were true simultaneously. The system added a note. Residual signature. Accumulation rate. Stationary presence. High. Mobile presence. Significantly lower. At current consumption. Passive level, mobile presence leaves approximately 23% of the residual signature of stationary presence per unit time. Note, above 25%. Consumption awakening, mobile presence leaves negligible. Residual signature, 23% of the stationary rate, and above 25% awakening, negligible. I was at 9.8%. The gap between 9.8 and 25 was the gap between leaving a readable signature everywhere I went and leaving almost nothing. Closing that gap required time. Time required safety. Safety in one location produced the residual signature that made the location unsafe. It was a compression problem. The window of development between current level and safe travel level had to be covered while moving fast enough to prevent residual accumulation from catching up to me. I had 18 minutes before the team leader's device hit moderate quality readings. I made 3 decisions fast. First, the pack moved, but not in a panicked full retreat. A panicked full retreat in random direction produced maximum track signature and maximum resonance scatter, both of which gave better tracking data to a team with 2 devices than a controlled directional movement. Third, Ash took the pack northeast, the direction the earlier misdirection had seeded as a false lead, staying below 200 meters of spread to minimize residual accumulation in the terrain. Third, Ash took the pack northeast, which was the direction the earlier misdirection had already seeded as a false lead, staying below 200 meters of lateral spread to minimize residual accumulation. The false lead in the northeast, combined with a fresh, strong southwest contact, would create a split picture for the 2 devices. 2 signals in 2 different directions from a team that was currently pointing north and had not yet committed to an advance line. Splitting their operational picture cost them coordination time. Coordination time was the resource I needed most. I communicated the plan to Ash in the fastest resonance exchange we had managed since he arrived. He considered it for 4 seconds. Then, "The southwest run is the part that concerns me." I sent back, "It concerns me too," which was honest, and that is the part I am doing myself, which was the only logically consistent position given the rest of the plan. He made the sound that I had started to understand was his version of, "I understand, and I do not like it, and I will be where I need to be when you come back." He turned to the pack and began communicating the movement in the way he communicated everything, with the economy of something that had been doing this for a very long time and had reduced the unnecessary to zero. I looked at Mother, who was already reading the situation from Ash's communication pattern and my posture and whatever the 9 days of observed behavior had taught her to read in me. She was already reading the situation from the combination of Ash's communication and my posture, and the 9 days of observed behavior that had taught her when movement was urgent rather than tactical. She looked at me for 2 seconds, with those frozen honey eyes, and whatever she calculated in those 2 seconds produced the same result it always produced. She turned and moved. I activated Shadow Step for the crossing to the valley entrance because the entrance was the highest exposure point of the plan, then deactivated it when I cleared the ridge and started moving southwest. The difference between moving with Shadow Step active and moving without it was something I felt immediately in the resonance output. Without the ability running, I was broadcasting at baseline level, which was considerably louder than anything I had produced since the controlled expression practice sessions with the dead wood. The woman's device was going to feel this contact at whatever the current distance produced, and the signal it read needed to be strong enough and directional enough to redirect the team's operational focus. The distance between me and the team was 2.3 kilometers and growing as I moved southwest. And at that range and baseline output, the system assessed the reading as strong directional contact. At 3 to 4 kilometers and baseline output, the system assessed the detection reading they would get as strong directional, southwest moving. Exactly what I needed them to see. And the system updated as I covered the first kilometer southwest to confirm the team was responding to the contact the way I had calculated. Strike team response to new contact. Woman's device has registered southwest signal. Team leader is redirecting. 3 members moving southwest to investigate. Remaining 5 members holding at current position. Note, team has split. 3 toward your current position, 5 in northeast quadrant. Time until 3-member subunit reaches your projected route. 34 minutes. 34 minutes. I had bought more than I needed for the pack to clear the valley and begin accumulating distance in the northeast. I needed 15 minutes for the pack to reach a point where their residual accumulation would be below the readable threshold for the baseline mapper at current distance. Ash would manage the pace. I trusted that completely after 11 days of watching how he moved through situations that required judgment calls rather than instructions. I ran the southwest route for 22 minutes, covering 4 kilometers, leaving the kind of trail a team with a detection device could follow without difficulty, because a trail too clean looked deliberate. Then I stopped at the specific location I had pre-selected on the mental map, the exposed rock formation with the same mineral composition as the valley's northern ridge. A large section of exposed rock, the same mineral composition as the valley's northern ridge, the specific composition that created the background resonance interference. I touched the rock and pulled every technique Ash had taught me into simultaneous operation. The resonance output dropped to minimum sustainable. The expression pattern pulled inward to its smallest possible configuration, while the output dropped below the sustained baseline, and the shadow step layered over both. From the perspective of the woman's device, the southwest signal had entered a section of interfering terrain and dropped below readable threshold. Not disappeared, not gone. Reduced below readable, which to a trained operator would read as either natural terrain interference or deliberate concealment, and the distinction between those two interpretations would determine whether they continued or stopped. The system watched with me. 3-member subunit has reached your route entry point, tracking your trail southwest. Pace, consistent with confident tracking. Note, they believe they have a clear contact. Estimated time until they reach the interference terrain and lose the signal. 11 minutes. 11 minutes. I held the rock and the minimum output and the shadow step and did not move. The pack was northeast with Ash, putting distance between themselves and the valley at a pace I could not monitor from this position because my passive scan radius put them at its outer edge. I had to trust that, and trust was not something I had been consistently good at in either of my lives, but 11 days of watching Ash make correct calls had built the foundation for it. I had been the kind of person who kept every browser tab open and refreshed constantly and built redundant systems for things that did not need them, because the alternative was accepting unmonitored variables. In this life, I had been learning that some variables were always outside the control window, and the skill was building the rest well enough that those variables had the best possible odds of landing correctly. I had built the other parts of the plan as well as I could build them with the tools and time available. Ash was the variable that existed outside the control window. He had survived something that had killed every other member of his species. He had found me across a distance I still could not measure. He had spent 11 days teaching me things with a patience that suggested he had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment for a very long time. He was going to get the pack to safety. I held the rock and the minimum output and waited. The system updated at the 11-minute mark. 3-member subunit has reached interference terrain. Signal loss registered on their equipment. Subunit has stopped. Operator is running secondary sweep. Secondary sweep result, no clear contact. No clear contact. Conferring. 2 minutes passed in which I held position at the rock and held the minimum output and held the shadow step and did not move. 2 minutes passed. Subunit decision. Returning to main team position. Assessment. Contact was lost in terrain interference. Recommending escalation. Request to guild for 3rd-tier equipment. 3rd-tier equipment. They were requesting escalation. I filed that and what it implied for the timeline and kept holding position. Main team reuniting at northeast search site. Full team movement. Southwest. Returning toward base camp. Note. Team is ending today's operation. Estimated return to base. 2 hours. They were pulling back, not abandoning. Pulling back to file a report and request escalation. 3rd-tier equipment, whatever that meant in guild classification terms, was coming. The timeline on that arrival was something the system did not have data on, which was the kind of unknown that belonged in the back of the planning model rather than the front. I stayed at the rock for 15 more minutes after the system confirmed the team was moving away from my position. Then I deactivated Shadow Step and let the resonance output return to the controlled low level I had been maintaining for the past 2 days. The system ran a check I had not requested. Consumption passive, 10.1%, recovery from early termination. Event proceeding, Shadow Step. Efficiency, 40%. Curse, Seal, 91%. Level, 3. Then, long-range pack signal. Detected, northeast direction. Distance, approximately 6 kilometers. Signal profile. Consistent with Ash's bloodline compatibility. Signature. Pack is moving. Pack is intact. 6 kilometers northeast. Moving, intact. I stood up from the rock and oriented northeast and started running at the pace I had been running for 81 days when the situation required it. The cold was the specific cold of late afternoon in deep winter, the kind that has a sound when the wind moves through the trees, a low constant note the forest makes at a certain temperature. I had been in this world for 81 days, which was not a number that should have felt significant, but did, the way round numbers always feel significant when you're counting something that matters. I had started by falling face first into snow, and had arrived at the current moment through a sequence of decisions that had cost things I had not expected to cost, and produced things I had not expected to produce. The team was pulling back. The pack was 6 kilometers northeast and moving. The consumption passive was at 10.1% and recovering. The seal was at 91% and dropping on a timeline I had started to understand better after the early termination event. It had shown me what the drop rate felt like in acceleration. I thought, while running northeast under the late afternoon sky, about the entity to the north, the one that had sent the survey team, the one Ash had described as an old enemy dressed as an ally. It had sent a survey team, then a strike team. The strike team had now requested escalation to 3rd-tier equipment. There was a progression in that sequence. Survey to strike to 3rd-tier escalation. Each step represented a higher level of resource commitment. Each step suggested the entity to the north was receiving the information from these operations and making decisions based on it. It was learning what I was and what I could do at each level, and each time it learned something, it upgraded what it sent next. That was not the behavior of something trying to eliminate a threat quickly. That was the behavior of something building a profile, something that wanted to understand what it was dealing with before committing to a final approach, which was the most dangerous kind of patient because it was patient with a purpose. I thought about Ash's translation. An old enemy dressed as an ally, something that was there during the purge and survived it by choosing a side, something with its own reasons for watching the next iteration of this bloodline. Whatever those reasons were, they had been patient for 212 years. They could afford to send a survey team and a strike team and request 3rd-tier escalation, and wait between each step for the information to come back before deciding on the next one. They could afford to watch me develop and learn my capabilities at each level before deciding what category I belonged in. And whatever category they finally assigned me would determine whether the 3rd-tier escalation was the last thing they sent, or the first step in a different kind of sequence entirely. I ran northeast through the winter forest and thought about what it meant to be profiled by something that had spent 2 centuries watching for me. And then I stopped thinking about it because the passive scan registered a new contact in the northeast quadrant that had not been there when the pack left, with a signal profile unlike anything in 81 days. Something was different in the new contact's movement pattern relative to the pack. I ran the passive scan with the full precision I could manage at 3 kilometers in closing. 6 contacts: Ash, Mother, Brick, the 2 younger pups, and 1 more contact that had not been in the valley when I left. New contact, adult. moving in close coordination with the pack, which meant either the pack had accepted it, or it was moving alongside in a configuration that read as coordination but was not yet confirmed as trust. I broke into a full run northeast. The new contact's signal profile was not in any category I had encountered in 81 days. Not prey, not predator in the standard classification, not the residue of human equipment, something that the system was attempting to classify and had not completed the classification on. The system updated while I was running. New contact classification in progress. Signal profile. Unusual. Preliminary assessment. The contact is not human, not standard wildlife. Note: signal carries elements consistent with highly elevated supernatural classification. Note: this contact is aware of your approach and is waiting. Aware of my approach and waiting. I slowed to a walk as I closed the final kilometer. Not because I was tired, but because entering an unknown contact at full speed communicated information I was not ready to share. I cleared the tree line into the small natural clearing and stopped, reading the positions before I moved any further into the open. Ash was to my left. Mother and the pups were behind him. Brick was to my right, in the specific position of an animal that has decided to stay between the pack and an unknown variable without being directed to do so. In the center of the clearing, sitting in the snow with the absolute stillness of something that had made peace with being completely visible, was the new contact, and it was larger than Ash. It was larger than Ash. The fur was white, not the white of winter camouflage, but a specific luminous white that seemed to hold light differently from everything around it. The eyes were the color of deep water, the specific shade that exists at the point where light stops reaching, and the cold is absolute, and everything down there is pressure and patience. It looked at me with those eyes, and the system produced a classification that I read twice before I accepted it as something other than an error. Contact classification complete. Entity type ancient bloodline. Unclassified category. Note: this entity predates the guild classification system by an unknown duration. Note: this entity is not hostile. Note: this entity has been waiting for 212 years. 212 years, the exact duration since the Great Purge. I read the classification twice. The exact duration since the Great Purge. The exact duration since the last confirmed Cursed Dire Wolf had been eliminated, and the records had been sealed and the species had been listed as extinct. This entity had been waiting since then. I looked at it. It looked back at me with those deep water eyes, and the patience of something that had measured time in centuries rather than days. And then it made a sound that was not in any category of wolf communication I had learned in 81 days, not translatable by the system the way resonance communication was translatable. But I understood it anyway, not through the system, and not through anything Ash had taught me, through something in the curse itself that recognized the frequency before the conscious mind processed it. Through something in the curse itself that recognized the frequency the way a tuning fork recognizes a note, responding before the conscious mind had processed the sound. The sound said, "There you are." And underneath that, "I have been here the whole time." And underneath that, in a frequency that predated language, "You are not the last. You are the beginning." And underneath that, quieter, in the frequency that the baseline mapper had been reading from the terrain of the valley as a 9-day habitation signature, "You are not the last. You are the beginning." Not up. Outward, in a direction I did not have a word for yet. The system had one word for what it was reading, and it was the word I had been waiting 81 days to see appear. Not up. Outward. The system had one word for what it was reading, and I had been waiting 81 days to see that word. I want to tell you something about the moment before everything changes, because every story has one, and this one was no different. The moment before everything changes does not announce itself. It does not come with dramatic music, or a shift in the light, or any of the signals that stories use to tell you to pay attention because something important is happening now. It just arrives, quiet and cold and looking like any other moment. And the only way you know it was the one that mattered, is by looking back from wherever it takes you. This was mine. Standing in a clearing on day 81 of my second life, level 3, seal at 91%, facing something that had been waiting 212 years for this exact moment. And the word awakening, blinking in my vision like a notification that had finally stopped waiting for me to be ready and had decided to arrive whether I was ready or not. I looked at the entity in the center of the clearing and tried to classify what I was seeing against everything I had learned in 81 days. Large, a white fur that held light differently from everything around it. Eyes that specific shade of deep water that exists where pressure and cold replace everything else. Stillness that was not the stillness of something at rest, but the stillness of something that had never needed to move quickly because the world accommodated its pace. The system had classified it as an ancient bloodline entity that predated the guild classification system by an unknown duration. That was a sentence that contained a significant amount of information and almost no specifics. which was the kind of classification that meant the system was working from incomplete records and knew it. Ash was to my left and had not moved since I entered the clearing, his eyes on the entity with an expression I had not seen from him before in 11 days of watching him read every situation we had been in. His eyes were on the entity, and his posture was something I had not seen from him before. Not submission and not aggression, and not the alert watchfulness he used for everything else. Something closer to recognition. I sent a resonance communication toward him, keeping it as tight and quiet as I could manage at current range. "You know what this is?" I sent, keeping the resonance communication as tight and quiet as I could manage. The translation came back without the usual pause, which meant he had been ready for the question. "I know what it is not. It is not from the guild. It is not from any bloodline I have encountered in the decades since my awakening. What it is, I was told about once, a long time ago, by the person who taught me. I was told that if I ever found the third generation, and if the third generation survived long enough to reach the first real awakening event, something would come. Something that had been present at the beginning of what we carry," he communicated. She called it the First. He had held that name for decades without knowing if he would ever need to use it. I looked at the entity in the clearing with that word sitting in my understanding and tried to decide if it changed the calculation. In games, the entity that had been present at the beginning of a power system was almost always one of two things: the source that could unlock what nothing else could unlock, or the final test that determined whether you were worth unlocking at all. I had no way to know which one this was yet. The entity had not moved. It had not made another sound after the one that the curse had translated without the system's help. It was simply present the way things are present when they have no anxiety about whether their presence will be understood, because they have existed long enough that those questions stop being interesting. I walked toward it, not fast, not slow, the same pace I used when I was trying to communicate deliberate intention rather than reaction. It watched me close the distance with those deep water eyes and made no movement in any direction. I stopped 2 meters from it. At 2 meters, the passive scan was reading something I had not encountered in any entity I had been close to. Not Mother, not Ash, not any of the wildlife I had cataloged over 81 days of continuous mapping. The entity was not producing a resonant signal. It was not suppressing one. It was not broadcasting, and it was not shielding. It was simply not generating the kind of output that every living thing in this world produced as a byproduct of existing. Either the biological resonance generation had been replaced by something else entirely, or the baseline frequency it operated on was so far outside my readable range that the scan found nothing. The system had a note. Passive scan data. On current entity, insufficient. This entity operates on a frequency outside the range. Your current development level can read as consumption. Passive increases above 25%. Additional data will become available. Current readable data, none. Assessment. The entity is aware of your scan and is not objecting to it. Not objecting to the scan, aware of it and letting it run, which was information about the nature of what I was dealing with, even if the scan itself returned nothing readable. The entity had arrived near the pack without triggering Ash or Mother, which meant either extraordinary sensory discipline on its part, or it had been recognized before it got close enough to matter. Ash had said he knew what it was not, and then he had said what it was, approximately, in the language of something described by someone who had never encountered it directly, but had been told to expect it. The First. Something present at the beginning of what we carry. I thought about the lore entry I had read on day 1, the Cursed Dire Wolf. Power accumulated through consumption. No recorded ceiling. And the reason there was no recorded ceiling was that the consumption mechanic had no logical endpoint. It consumed. It grew. It consumed more. The only limit was whatever the universe decided to place on it. It consumed. It grew. It consumed more. It grew more. The only ceiling was whatever the universe decided to place on it. And the universe, in this world, had apparently decided not to place one. Where did that kind of power come from? Not from evolution. Not from random mutation. Not from the kind of gradual development that produced normal apex predators, from something that had designed it, or from something that was it, in an older form, a form that predated the version the guilds had cataloged and eliminated. I looked at the entity. It looked back. I asked the only question that mattered. The resonance communication I sent was not through the standard frequency band I had been practicing with. I did not consciously choose a different band. The curse chose it for me, the way it had chosen the translation of the entity's sound without being asked. The question was, what am I going to become? The entity was still for 3 full seconds after I sent it. Then it made a sound. Not the same sound as before. Something longer, more structured, with a specific architecture of a communication rather than acknowledgement. The system did not translate it. The curse did. It came through in the same way the first sound had come through, not as language, but as meaning that arrived fully formed without passing through the usual processing steps. The meaning was more than what the guilds feared. which was a range I could not yet measure, and less than what the records imagined, which meant there was a ceiling even if nobody had found it. Exactly what this world needs at this specific moment in its history, which is a moment that looks like any other moment from the outside and is not. I sat with that for a while, more than what the guilds feared. That was a category of power I could not yet measure from inside my current position at level 3 with 91% seal and 10.1% consumption awakening. Less than what the records imagined. That was interesting. The records, sealed by the Hunter Guilds after the Great Purge, had apparently described something that exceeded whatever I was going to become, which either meant the records had been exaggerated by people who wanted justification for what they had done, or there was a ceiling after all, and it was lower than no recorded ceiling suggested. Exactly what this world needs at this specific moment in its history, which was a sentence that contained a significant amount I could not yet process because I did not have the context for what this world needed. I had been in this world for 81 days, and I had been focused almost entirely on survival and development, and staying below the detection threshold of people who wanted me dead. What the world needed was not a category I had been tracking. The entity moved for the first time since I had entered the clearing. It stood, and the act of standing from where it had been sitting was not the act of an animal getting up from rest. It was something that reminded me more of a system coming online, the specific quality of capability moving from inactive to present. It walked toward me. I held my position. It stopped close enough that I could see individual variations in its white fur, depth, and dimension in the way real things have depth when you are close enough to stop seeing them as one object. And then it did something I had not expected and had no framework for. It touched its nose to the center of my forehead. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds. What happened inside those 2 seconds was not something I have adequate language for, because the language that would describe it accurately did not exist in any framework I had brought from my previous life. The closest approximation I can offer is this. Imagine every locked door in a building opening at once, not violently, not with any force or drama. Just the sound of mechanisms releasing, in sequence, one after another, each one unlocking the next, a cascade of openings that move through the building from the basement to the roof in a single continuous motion. That was the inside of those 2 seconds. The system produced a notification cascade that I had never seen before and have not seen since. Awakening event. Stage 1 initiated by external catalyst. Curse seal. Integrity dropping. 91%, 87%, 82%, 76%, 71%. Consumption passive. 10.1%, 18%, 27%, 34%, 41%. Shadow step. Efficiency increasing. 40%, 65%, 88%, Void Fang, partially unlocked, available at 30% effectiveness. New ability, unlocking Resonance Field, passive. You project a field that bends external detection attempts, range 200 meters. Effectiveness, increasing with development. Level up, 4, level up, 5, level up, 6. Note, Awakening event is temporary in nature. Gains from this event are permanent. The rate of development initiated will stabilize at the current elevated rate rather than returning to pre-event baseline. The rate of development initiated by this event will stabilize at current elevated rate rather than returning to pre-event baseline. Level 6, Seal at 71%. Consumption passive at 41%, which was past the 25% threshold the system had identified as the point where mobile presence left negligible residual signature in terrain. Shadow Step at 88% efficiency. Void Fang at 30%. Resonance Field active at 200 meters range. Level 6. I read it all twice before I let myself believe the numbers. Resonance Field active. I stood in the clearing, and the entity stepped back and looked at me, and I felt what had changed in a way that went beyond the system notifications. The world was louder. That was the first thing. Not louder in the sound sense, louder in the information sense. The passive scan that I had been running as a conscious directed process was now running automatically on the full radius without effort, updating constantly, feeding data without being asked to. The resonance output I had been managing carefully for 81 days had shifted into redirection, bending incoming detection attempts away, rather than simply reducing what I was producing. The resonance field the system had just unlocked was not a passive masking effect. It was an active redirection, bending incoming detection attempts away from me rather than simply reducing my output. The difference between those two things was significant. Suppression meant producing less signal. A sufficiently sensitive device could still detect a reduced signal if it was calibrated to the correct threshold. Redirection meant incoming scans were deflected before they resolved a reading. It did not matter how sensitive the device was if the signal it was trying to read was actively being turned away from the sensor. Third tier escalation. The entity to the north had requested it before the awakening event. It was now inbound toward a target whose profile had changed significantly while it was in transit. Whatever equipment that classification represented, it was going to arrive in this territory to find a target that had shifted from a suppression strategy to a redirection strategy while it was in transit. I thought about the woman's upgraded device, the directional sensor, the baseline mapper, and the 31% detection probability that had been the ceiling of my threat model for 2 weeks. The 31% detection probability at Valley Range that had been the ceiling of the threat model I had been building for 2 weeks. The resonance field at 200 meters range, and increasing with development, had just changed that ceiling significantly. The system did not give me a revised detection probability, which I suspected meant it was still calculating, but the direction of the change was not ambiguous. Ash walked into my peripheral vision and looked at me for a long time with those old eyes, reading whatever the awakening event had left visible on the surface of what I was. Then he made the sound that I had learned meant something between acknowledgement and, "I see what happened, and I'm glad it happened, and I have been waiting for this since before you knew what it was." I looked at the entity. It had returned to its sitting position in the center of the clearing, the absolute stillness back, as if the 2 seconds of contact had not occurred. I asked it, through the Curse's communication channel, the question I had been building toward since I understood what it was. What is the entity to the north? The one that has been sending people to find me? The entity was still for a moment. Then the meaning arrived. Something that was made rather than born. Something that was present during the purge, not as a participant, but as a tool that learned over time to have preferences. A tool that has been operating with preferences for longer than the people who made it have been alive, which means it is no longer accurately described as a tool, but has not become anything else with a clear name. It wants to find you because it was designed to find you, and it has been running that design for 200 years with nothing else to occupy the resources it has accumulated in that time. A calculation that is not resolved, watching and profiling and building a picture. The most dangerous kind of patience, because it was patience with a purpose it had not yet declared to anyone. I thought about the escalation request, third-tier equipment inbound, the entity to the north watching the operation and receiving the reports and updating its calculation with each new piece of data. And now the target of that calculation had jumped from level 3 to level 6, activated a resonance field, and every inbound piece of equipment had been calibrated for the thing it had been. The calculation the entity to the north was running had just received a significant new variable. I wondered how long it would take to update. The system gave me something I had not asked for. Entity to the north. Updated assessment based on new data. The entity has detected the awakening event. Resonance output. During the awakening notification, cascade was significantly elevated above previous baseline. Elevated output duration, 4 seconds. Detectable range, estimated 12 kilometers. Entity to the north is within 12 kilometers. Assessment. It knows what just happened. It knows what just happened. I looked at the clearing around me. Ash, the pack at the tree line, the ancient entity sitting in the snow like it had been there since before the trees were planted, the winter forest beyond in every direction, and somewhere within 12 kilometers, the entity that had been watching and calculating had just felt the variable it was tracking change shape in a way requiring a complete model update. The calculation it had been running had just received information that could not be processed incrementally, the kind of information that required a complete model update rather than a parameter adjustment. I did not know how fast it could update. I did not know what it would decide. What I knew was that the gap between what I had been and what I was now was the most useful resource I currently possessed. What I did know was that I was no longer level 3 with a 91% seal, and whoever arrived next was calibrated for the thing I had been and was going to encounter the thing I had become. I looked at the ancient entity. I sent, "How long do I have before the calculation resolves?" The meaning that came back was not a duration. It was something more like a condition, until it decides whether you are more useful as an ally or more dangerous as an enemy. The calculation is about which of those two categories produces a better outcome for whatever it is trying to accomplish. It has been running versions of that calculation for 200 years on entities that never reached the point where the calculation mattered. You are the first one where it matters. The first one where it matters. I thought about what that meant in terms of the operational timeline I was working inside, and what it implied about the rate at which the calculation would now be moving. 2 centuries of watching for something that never arrived, running a calculation that never resolved because the input never developed far enough to make the two categories meaningfully different from each other. And now I had level 6, resonance field, void fang at 30%, consumption passive at 41% and climbing, shadow step at 88 efficiency and still increasing. The calculation was resolving because I had become something that made the two categories, ally and enemy, genuinely different in their implications for whatever the entity to the north was trying to accomplish. The ancient entity stood again. This time, it oriented itself not toward me, but toward the north, toward whatever was within 12 kilometers and updating its model. It made a sound in the direction of north. One sound, short, deliberate, at a frequency that was significantly below anything I could have produced at any point in the 81 days before this clearing. The passive scan registered something at the northern edge of its newly expanded range that it had not been able to read before the awakening event. Something that felt like a presence, but registered as a signal pattern. Not biological, not the equipment signature of the strike team. Something different in the way that categories of thing are different rather than just degrees of the same thing. The entity to the north. For the first time in 81 days, I was reading it directly rather than through the system's second-hand assessment. It was old. Not in the way Ash was old, which was old in the way living things are old when they have survived longer than usual. Old in the way constructed things are old when they have been running continuously past the duration their original design accounted for, accumulating data and something a living thing would call experience. And it was aware. Not of me specifically, not yet with the resolution that the third-tier equipment would provide, but aware of the clearing, aware of what had happened here, aware that the variable it had been tracking for 2 centuries had just changed significantly in a way that moved the unresolved calculation toward its first genuine decision point. The ancient entity's sound died in the frozen air. The northern presence did not respond. But the passive scan registered a shift in its signal pattern that felt like attention being redirected. The way a person who has been looking at one thing turns to look at something else, except the scale was larger and the medium was not sight, but something I was only beginning to have the vocabulary for. I looked at the ancient entity and sent the question through the Curse's communication channel rather than the standard resonance band. What did you just say to it? The meaning came back as, I told it that the calculation does not have as much time as it believes it does, and that the choice between ally and enemy is not the only choice available. There is a third option that it has not modeled, because the variable required for it to exist has not existed until today. A third option. I thought about everything I had learned in 81 days about the entity to the north, patient, resourced, operating with preferences that had exceeded its original design, running a calculation that had been waiting 2 centuries for a meaningful input. Something like that did not become something like that without being capable of updating when the data required it. The question was whether the update would go in a direction that helped me or a direction that accelerated the timeline on everything that was currently trying to end me. The ancient entity looked at me. The meaning it sent was not a reassurance. The entity was not in the business of reassurance in any form I had encountered so far. It was information. The third option only exists if you reach the development threshold before the calculation resolves. The calculation is moving faster now. The threshold is not as far as it was 2 hours ago. Whether you close the gap in time depends on choices you have not yet made and circumstances that have not yet arrived. This is not something I can resolve for you. What I can tell you is that what I just did to the signal pattern of the northern entity bought you something. Not much. Enough. Enough. I sat in the clearing in the winter forest with level 6 and a resonance field, and the most complicated operational picture I had faced since arriving in this world, and I thought about what enough meant. In my previous life, enough had been a word I used when I was accepting a compromise. When the best case was not available, and the next best case was what existed. In this life, enough had started to mean something different. It meant the margin existed. It meant the gap was closable. It meant the work I'd been doing since day one, the patterns and maps and careful accumulation of capability, had put me close enough to the threshold that enough was a real word rather than a polite one. I looked at Ash. He was watching the northern edge of the forest. I looked at Mother and the pack at the tree line. Brick was in his self-assigned position between the pack and the clearing, which was the position of something that had decided it was responsible for a perimeter without being asked to make that decision. The 2 younger pups were pressed against Mother in the way small things press against large familiar things, when the large familiar things are paying close attention to something uncertain. And then there was the ancient entity, sitting in the snow in the center of the clearing, carrying whatever it had carried for longer than the guild classification system had existed. This was my pack, not the pack I had been born into, not the pack I had inherited by transmigrating into a body in a frozen forest. The one I had built through 81 days of falling over and getting up and making decisions and building the next decision on the foundation of what the previous one had taught me. This was the thing I was going to protect. Not because a system notification told me to, not because the lore entry described it as my purpose, because I had been here long enough that the thing I was protecting had become real in the specific way that things become real when you have invested in them past the point where they are abstract. The system updated. Resonance. Field status, operational. Range, 200 meters. Detection deflection. Rate 67% at current development, increasing. Note, third tier guild equipment will have a penetration rate of approximately 40% against current resonance field strength. Recommended development target before third tier. Arrival. Consumption. Passive above 55%. Estimated time for third tier equipment arrival. Based on standard guild escalation protocols, 6 to 14 days. 6 to 14 days. Consumption passive from 41 to 55. The gap was 14 percentage points. The time was 6 to 14 days. Before the awakening event, I would have calculated that gap as requiring weeks of careful incremental practice at the rate I'd been developing before the clearing. After the awakening event, I was at 41%, and the automatic passive absorption was running continuously, and the elevated development rate was real, measurable in the movement of the number itself. 41.3 becoming 41.4 was the passive absorption running automatically, faster than it had been at the same percentage before the awakening changed the system's efficiency. The passive absorption running automatically in the background was faster than it had been at the same percentage before the awakening event changed the efficiency of the system. The passive absorption running in the background, the way it always ran during rest states now, was faster than it had been before the awakening event at the same passive absorption level. Something about the Stage 1 awakening had changed the efficiency of the system in ways beyond the raw percentage gains. I looked at the northern horizon and thought about 14 days, and the calculation the entity to the north was running, and the third option the ancient entity had told it existed and had not told me what it was. I looked at the ancient entity. What is the third option? The meaning came back immediately this time, without the pause that usually preceded significant information. You already know what it is. You have been building it since day one without knowing what you were building. Every decision you made about the pack, every time you chose protection over concealment, every time you treated what you were carrying as something to be developed rather than something to be hidden. You have been building the answer to a question. The entity to the north has been asking for 200 years, the entity communicated. And the answer is not the one it expected. The answer is not what it expected, because the entities before you did not survive long enough to demonstrate it in a form the calculation could read as a meaningful data point. I thought about what Ash had told me about the Purge, the guilds, and their motivation. An existential threat to the established power hierarchy. The specific phrasing of that classification. Not a physical threat, not a danger in the ordinary sense of large animals with dangerous abilities. An existential threat to the hierarchy itself, to the structure of power that the guilds represented and enforced and derived their position from, which meant eliminating the thing was not about safety, but about the hierarchy protecting itself. And the entity to the north, which had survived the Purge by choosing the guild's side, had spent 200 years watching for the next iteration of the thing the guilds had classified as existential. Not to eliminate it. The guilds eliminated things. The entity to the north was watching and calculating and waiting to decide. What it was deciding was what a fully developed Cursed Dire Wolf actually was, whether the guild classification was accurate, whether existential threat to the hierarchy was the right category, or whether there was another category that the guilds, who had everything to gain from that classification, had not included in their records. The entity to the north wanted to know if I was a threat or if I was something else. And what I had been building, without knowing I was building it, was the demonstration of something else, a pack, a protective function. Decisions made consistently over 81 days that prioritized the well-being of the things I was responsible for over the expansion of my own power. Every time I had the option to grow faster by pushing the consumption aggressive, and every time I had chosen the slower, safer method because faster was detectable. Every time Brick had been difficult and I had managed it rather than resolving it with force. Every time Mother had needed something and I had found a way to provide it within the operational constraints. I had not been building a weapon. I had been building evidence. The northern presence was still at the edge of my newly expanded passive scan range. Still watching. Still running the calculation that had just received the ancient entity's communication and was now incorporating new variables. The system updated. Entity to the north. Signal pattern. Update. The entity has been stationary for 4 hours and 23 minutes. Unusual behavior, relative to previous movement pattern. Note. Stationary pattern consistent with intensive processing state. Assessment. The calculation is an active update phase. Active update phase. Processing. 14 days until third tier equipment arrived, and the entity that had sent everything was currently in a state that the system read as intensive processing rather than operational activity. I looked at Ash. You knew what the ancient entity was going to do when you brought the pack northeast. You knew it would be here. The translation came back. I knew it was time. I did not know exactly what would happen. She told me that when the third generation reached the first awakening event, What had been waiting would come. She did not tell me what it was, only that I would know it when I saw it, and that I should not be afraid of it even though I would want to be. He paused. She was right on both counts. I thought about the woman who had pushed him into cover and stayed outside, so the device got a fix on her instead. Who had been preparing for a third generation she would not survive to see. Who had told Ash things that were still arriving with accuracy decades later. She had known this moment was possible, had built toward it across generations, had died keeping the bloodline chain intact so someone could stand in this clearing on day 81 and receive something she had spent her life making sure could be received. I did not have a word for what that kind of preparation deserved from the person who had received it, so I filed the weight of it and kept it where it would inform the decisions ahead. This time, it did not orient north, it oriented toward me. The meaning it sent was not a conclusion or an instruction. It was something that landed more like a beginning. The Stage 1 awakening has been completed. The development path is now open at the rate the system has described. The entity to the north is processing new information. The guilds do not know what happened in this clearing and will not know until the third-tier equipment arrives and finds data that does not match the profile they sent it to find. You have time. Not unlimited time. Enough time. What you do with it will determine whether the calculation resolves in your favor. What you do with it. I looked at the pack, at the forest around us, at the level 6 system notifications still processing in the background, at the seal at 71% and dropping toward a threshold I could not yet see but could feel, approaching the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. What I did with it. In my previous life, I had been someone who made plans, spreadsheets and optimization models and contingency frameworks. Someone who built structures around problems and worked systematically through them until the problem was inside a box with a label on it. In this life, I had been doing the same thing, just in a medium that involved frozen ground and wolf communication and system notifications instead of office software and deadline emails. The problem in front of me was the same kind of problem I had always been best at. Not the problem with the obvious solution. The problem where the solution required seeing a connection between things that looked unrelated until you found the angle they shared. The entity to the north was calculating. It was rational. It had been designed to be rational and had been running on that design for 200 years. Rational things updated when the data required it. Rational things did not continue in a direction when the evidence pointed clearly elsewhere. And I had been building evidence for 81 days that pointed in a very specific direction. The evidence I had been building for 81 days was exactly the kind of evidence a rational calculating entity would need to update a category that had been fixed for 2 centuries on incomplete data. The third option was not an alliance in the formal sense. It was not a negotiation or an agreement or any of the structured relationships that entities like the one to the north might have classified those terms as. The third option was demonstration. Continued. Past the point where it could be dismissed as temporary or situational. I had 14 days. At the current development rate, I would reach 55% consumption passive in approximately 9 days. The resonance field's deflection rate would be above 80% against third-tier equipment within 11 days at the projected efficiency curve. I had the time, I had the direction, I had Ash and the pack and an ancient entity that had just done something to the signal pattern of the thing trying to find me, buying margin I did not have before. I had enough. The ancient entity looked at me one more time. The meaning it sent last was the simplest one it had given me in the entire exchange. Remember why you are doing this. When it gets difficult, and it will get difficult in ways you have not yet imagined, remember that the why is more important than the how. The how changes with circumstances. The why is what stays constant and keeps the how from losing its direction. I thought about that. The why was the pack. The why was the protective function I had been building without knowing I was building it. The thing the ancient entity had told me, the entity to the north was now incorporating into its calculation. The why was that I had died alone in a gaming chair with 17 browser tabs open and a cold bowl of ramen and an unlocked screen and nothing in the space around me that was warm. And I had been given something else instead. Something I had not asked for and had not chosen and had not been prepared for and had spent 81 days learning how to deserve. And I was not going to let it go because something 200 years old had run a calculation and come up short on data. It was going to get more data. The ancient entity turned from the clearing and walked into the trees in the direction it had come from. Not quickly, not dramatically. The way something leaves when it knows it can come back and does not need to make the departure feel permanent. It was gone in 30 seconds. The clearing was just a clearing again, snow and pine and the winter silence of a forest in deep cold. I stood where I had been standing and ran the passive scan across everything in the expanded 400-meter range, reading the positions and the signatures and the quality of the quiet. Ash at my left, Mother and the pack at the tree line, Brick still in his self-appointed position, the northern horizon with its unresolved calculation, the expanded 400 meters of automatic continuous range, and somewhere below all of it, running quietly in the background, the way it had been running since the touch in the center of my forehead, the consumption passive at 41.7 and climbing, level 6, seal at 71, resonance, field at 67% deflection and increasing, shadow step at 88 efficiency, void fang at 30%, which I had not yet used and which the system had flagged as available. The third tier equipment was 6 to 14 days away. The calculation was an active update phase. The entity that had been waiting 212 years had come and delivered something that could not have been delivered any other way, and had left without asking for anything in return. I looked at Ash. The translation he sent was short, the shortest communication he had produced in 11 days. Now we run, not away, not in retreat, in the specific direction that closed the gap between where I was and where I needed to be before the 14 days were up. I sent back, agreed. And then I looked at the pack. Mother, who had followed me from the valley into uncertainty without hesitation, after 69 days of watching me make decisions that consistently paid out. Brick, who had taken 3 seconds before following the evacuation order, and had not taken even 1 second since. The 2 younger pups who had been asleep for most of the significant events of the past 24 hours, and who I was going to make sure stayed that way for as long as possible. I had one more thing to do before we moved. I oriented myself north, toward the entity that was processing, toward the calculation that had entered its active update phase. I did not send a resonance communication. The range was too far, and the frequency mismatch was too large, and the development level required to bridge those gaps directly was still weeks away. What I sent was something the resonance field projected rather than standard resonance communication. The specific frequency profile of an entity that was present and aware and not concealing what it was. The specific frequency profile of an entity that was present and aware and not hiding, sending the clearest possible version of what I was in the direction of something that was trying to classify what I was. Let the calculation have clean data. The passive scan held the northern edge for 5 seconds. Then the signal pattern of the entity to the north shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that resolved anything, but shifted in the way that things shift when new information has been incorporated into an ongoing process, and the process has taken one more step toward completion. One step, in a calculation that had been running for 2 centuries. I turned from north and looked at the forest ahead of me, 6 to 14 days. Consumption passive at 41.8 and climbing. A world that needed something I had been building without knowing I was building it. An entity waiting to decide. A pack behind me that had earned whatever I was capable of giving. The seal was at 71% and dropping. The seal dropping was no longer something I was trying to manage. It was something I was going to let happen at the rate the development required, because the alternative, 94% fatality, was not a calculation I was willing to keep inside my planning model. I moved northeast. The pack moved with me. Ash took the rear without being asked. Brick held the left flank. Mother kept the pups at pace without making it look like keeping. We moved through the winter forest in the specific formation of a pack that has figured out how to function as one thing rather than several things sharing a direction. The cold was serious and specific and entirely indifferent to anything I was thinking or planning, which I had come to regard as one of the more honest qualities this world had consistently demonstrated. The trees were tall and dark against a sky that had shifted from gray to the specific pale blue that happened in deep winter when the light came from every direction at once and cast no shadows. No shadows. I thought about that. Shadow step, at 88%. An ability that worked precisely because shadows were where things could be present without being fully registered. And I was moving through a world with no shadows at this specific moment in this specific light. That was fine. The shadows would come back. They always did. And when they did, I would be better at using them than I was right now, which was already considerably better than the version of me that had been face-planting into snow 81 days ago. The system ran quietly in the background. 41.9, 42. The number moved without being asked to move, which was the most useful thing about passive absorption at this level of development. I ran northeast, through the winter forest, toward the next decision and the one after that, and everything that came after those. At level 6, with the seal dropping, and the work that was never finished waiting ahead. The work was not finished. The work, I had learned across 2 lives now, was never finished. There was only the next part of it, and the next part of it was everything.